to be ruled. In the end, it'll be every man for himself.
What do we do?
We get ready. There was an idea to bring together a group of remarkable people. So when we needed them, they could fight the battles that we never could. Gentlemen, what are you prepared to do?
No offense, but I don't play well with others.
Big man in a suit of armor. Take that away. What are you?
Genius, billionaire, playboy, philanthropist. If we can't protect the Earth, you can be damn sure we'll avenge it.
Dr. Banner, your work is unparalleled, and I'm a huge fan of the way you lose control and turn into an enormous green rage monster.
Thanks.
Chama people, and welcome to our 153rd episode of Gold Standard, the Oscars movie podcast, where we travel through time, reviewing the films that earn their gold statue, or standard, if you will, and beyond. I am one of your co-hosts, DJ Nick, and as always, joining me at the Gold Standard Theatre is one of my two podcasting partners in crime, the professional nerd herself, Rachel Friend. Hey, Rachel, how are you today?
Oh, my professional nerd is going to thrive.
I know, in fact, I know you're very excited for this one. I mean, unfortunately, our co-host Zan Sprouse will not be joining us today, but do not fret, dear listeners. Like today's movie, she will return, because today we are reviewing The Avengers, selected by Rachel. This was directed by Joss Whedon, who also co-wrote the screenplay, and co-wrote the story with Zach Penn, and the score was by Alan Silvestri. An estimate to put in today's money, adjusted for inflation, this movie cost $300 million to make and made over $2 billion at the box office. It premiered at the El Capitan Theatre in Los Angeles on April the 11th of 2012 and was then released to the general public on May the 4th of 2012 and has a runtime of roughly 2 hours and 23 minutes. So, Rachel, I know you know this movie like the back of your hand, so I guess what did you make of it on your nth rewatch?
Oh my god. Yeah, I've lost track of how many times I've seen this movie. As big as the MCU is at this point, I mean, we're sitting here, a few months away from another Spider-Man, which technically is still Sony, but they have done a very good job of integrating the Sony, all of the Sony Spider-Verse into the MCU. And then Doomsday, is coming out, near Christmas, and which is going to be kind of the next. This is, I mean, we've got the Avengers, and then we had the Infinity War / Endgame, and now we're getting Doomsday, which is kind of like the third, like, big Avengers level event, as it were. And it's just wild to think, we did our review of Wonder Man on, the Five-ish Fangirls, and talking about, one of the meta things with Wonder Man is the wink and nod and acknowledgement to superhero fatigue. And not just with Marvel. I mean, obviously Marvel has been the most consistent comparatively to DC. They've been kind of very like, stop, start with their stuff. But just, people are just like, we had so long where superheroes were just not a thing, or if they were for kids. Obviously Tim Burton's Batman made it so it's like, oh, you can like these comic book things and they're not so childish. And then obviously, the Dark Knight trilogy made it even less childish. But to have this idea of this big cohesive universe was something that a lot of people just did not think could be possible. And the idea of a shared universe actually goes back to the early 2000s, before Disney ever stepped in. It was Marvel Entertainment, and they had a film division known as Marvel Films, and Avi Arad was the head of that. And he was like, maybe we could do. He's like, oh, the Spider-Man stuff, that's pretty good, but we could do better. We could do some good stuff with some of these other characters. So he formed Marvel Studios as as his own independent film studio, and Kevin Feige was his second in command. And Kevin Feige is a nerd all in himself. He has described himself as a fanboy, and he loved the idea of a shared universe. So they got a bunch of money, and we're going to do a bunch of individual character movies, and then do this big crossover movie. Arad ended up just walking away the year after forming this studio, and Kevin Feige got put in charge, and Arad was all like, it's never gonna work. And Feige was all like, no, we can do this. And he created kind of his own Avengers creative team with him, Louis Disposito, Dan Buckley, who was Marvel Comics president of publishing at the time, Marvel Entertainment's chief creative officer, Joe Crescenda, and Brian Michael Bendis, who was a comic book writer, and Alan Fine, who was the Marvel Entertainment president. And it started out as a Marvel Cinema Universe, and then changed it to Marvel Cinematic Universe. And they had this idea of releasing them in phases. And of course, Disney comes in late 2009 with a check essentially for $4 billion. And they were like, say less. And, it's like, well, you already got this distribution deal with Paramount, which is why you see the Paramount logo on a lot of the Phase 1 movies. At least you did to a point. And the idea was that Disney would then distribute by its own studio once they finished the deal with Paramount. And it's been kind of this whole thing ever since. And this is the culmination of that Phase 1. They gave us Iron Man, which obviously kickstarted the whole thing. It gave us Robert Downey Jr., making a huge comeback. He's slowly been making a comeback, but this was his chance at redemption in Hollywood's eyes. They brought him on, even though a lot of people still did not want to touch him. He'd been doing some independent type stuff. But nothing huge up until this point. So for him to get signed to something this big, multi-movie deal, spearheading, what could potentially be a huge franchise, people just thought that Marvel was crazy. And then you got Jon Favreau directing, and people are like, okay, you got this guy from, this actor with a bad reputation and most people don't want to touch, and you got the guy who directed Elf. Really? This is how we're gonna do things? Okay, whatever. But as we all know, Iron Man ended up doing very well, and then we get the start of many mid and post credit scenes with Samuel L. Jackson stepping out from the shadows, talking about the Avengers initiative, and it's like, okay, well, we've dropped the microphone, so we gotta follow this up, and they absolutely did. Feeding in different characters through some of the other different movies. Obviously, with Iron Man, we got introduced to Pepper Potts, Coulson, and the idea of Shield, and Nick Fury with obviously with the Hulk. Obviously, our Hulk, our Bruce Banner would change faces. But the idea of the Hulk backstory was still there. And with Thor, with Iron Man 2, you get the introduction of Natasha Romanoff, aka Black Widow. And then with Thor, you get the introduction of Thor, Loki, more Coulson, Jane, all these characters, Dr. Selvig, Hawkeye. So it's like, it just made perfect sense. It just was one of those things where it's like, from the outside, if you didn't know any better, you'd be like, oh, they took a gamble and it worked out. And it's like, yeah, it was a gamble, but it was a well thought out gamble. Like, I'm sure most of our listeners have seen that meme of what's his face, Charlie, I think, from Always Sunny, with the board with all this red string and everything. I'm fully convinced that Marvel Studios has a room that's like that, where the wall is just like, walls are covered with paper and printouts and pictures and different colored strings, for the timelines and stuff, connecting everything. It was a gamble, but I think it was a well planned, thought out gamble, which I think is why it paid off. You've got every actor that's been cast, it seems to be like, oh yes, absolutely, they're the best person for this role. Who could have done, and who else could have played this role? I mean, literally, the Nick Fury in the comics was designed to look like Samuel L. Jackson because they wanted to update him from the white, 70s-esque Hasselhoff, essentially, because David Hasselhoff played Nick Fury. Nick Fury and Samuel L. Jackson gave them the rights to use his likeness. So when it came to casting live action Nick Fury, who else but the guy it looks like the guy in the comics, because it is the guy in the comics. And the funny thing is I was dragged, much like my Metallica fandom, I was dragged into this fandom kicking and screaming by Chauncey. The same day that the first Iron Man was released was the same day that he asked me out. So our entire relationship has existed along with the MCU. And when we first started talking after he asked me out, before we had our first date and we were just getting to know each other better, one of the first things, messages that he sent to me was giving his kind of fanboy review of the Iron Man movie, because that he was going to go see that. And he was like, oh my God. And, he was totally in on it. And then he bought the DVDs and stuff, and he tried showing it to me. And I'm like, yeah, whatever. And then when we were in graduate school for our master's degree, we had to create this. We created this project, which I can give Nick the link, the relevant links to post, in the show notes or on social media or whatever, because I actually cover this whole project that we did in detail on an episode of the Five Australian Girls we did way early on. But essentially our master's project was built to fit within the MCU, knowing that the Avengers were coming. And because of, I was like, yeah, sure. Because at that point, Disney had purchased them, and we got married to Disney. And so we were like, yeah, and like work with what the idea was we were going to create a theme park ride for Disney. And we're like, well, they just bought Marvel, and it's kind of a hot thing. So we thought we'd strike while the iron was hot as far as topics. but because of that, I had to do what I do best is research, and that watching the MCU movies that I missed up to that point, and then we all went and saw Captain America: The First Avenger, because we were basing a lot of our storyline to go with our theme park attraction based on just the little tidbits they'd given us as far as continuity and characters knowing each other in the trailer. So by the time we got to Captain America: The First Avenger, I was pretty into it. So when we get to Avengers, and we're presenting our graduate project like, I don't know, like the week before the Avengers comes out. So we're all just like on the hype train. So we all, we go in to see this movie all the way back in 2012, and I'm just like, this is amazing. Walking out after it's over, and I've just been kind of hooked ever since. And the Metallica fandom, Chauncey is still the master on that, but in this case, the apprentice has become the master, because I have surpassed Chauncey as far as the MCU knowledge and consumption is concerned. But this is one of those things where this is lightning in a bottle, and shouldn't be something that could have been done again, because they set the bar so high with this. Getting making it make sense to have these characters finally come together, having all this star power. It's like I'm sure other people are like, oh my god, the egos and everything. But it's like, no, these guys immediately became friends. Of course, Chris Evans being, Steve Rogers in real life, immediately, even though there were very few times where all of the stars were together on set at the same time to keep the camaraderie going. Chris immediately started a text thread, with all of them, like, hey, want to go out for pizza? Hey, what? It's just been kind of, this was a big emotional moment for us as fans to really see the vision and really feel like, okay, they've done it. They've created a universe that if somebody offered, hey, do you want to go live here for a little bit? Absolutely, positively. Bye. Please and thank you. And now you kind of can at the parks. You've got Avengers Campus. Chauncey and I finally got to visit Avengers Campus last fall when we went to Disneyland, and they're already working on expanding it. They've got a lot of Avengers related stuff in the Asian parks that apparently is absolutely mind blowing. They now have one of the cruise line ships is essentially Marvel themed. A couple of them actually. Where you've got Black Panther / T'Challa as your kind of your every cruise ship that when you walk into the lobby in the center of the ship, there's always a statue of a Disney character that usually fits the theme of the ship. In this particular one, it's a statue of Black Panther / T'Challa. The newest ship that currently is sailing around Shanghai and those areas, Robert Downey Jr. is essentially the fairy godmother for that ship. So, Marvel knew what they were doing, and getting Disney to back it just made the absolute most sense in the entire world. Even though I was not necessarily a fan or comic book reader when this whole thing started, but when Disney came in, the announcement came out, I was like, honestly, that makes sense, because there is so much history there, because Marvel Comics itself is, it's been around for so long and just has this amazing catalog of characters and places and storylines that they can easily pull from and do what Disney does best, because what Disney does best is tell stories. and they always want to make sure that their stories are stories that people absolutely enjoy and feel like feel like they're part of it, even if it's not literally part of it. But visiting places like the theme parks allows people to have, feel like they're part of it and have some agency in it. And and it's just this was see, all these years later, what, we're 14 years now, at least as far as the real world is removed from the Battle of New York. It's like, if you could have told me that where we are now, then I might have actually believed you. Because up to that point, they'd given me no reason to not believe they couldn't pull this off, and they absolutely did. So I'm like, all right, let's see what next. And here we are now. I mean, the MCU is almost 20 years old now, and this is still one of those movies that is so important to the overall story of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, that you can't talk about the MCU without talking about the first time the Avengers came together, because it's so important and shows that that initial idea can work and does work and can be scaled and still work. And that is something that is so impressive. And I would continue to consume anything and everything that the MCU throws out as far as films and series and the like. But this is the one that I always come back to.
And I can certainly see why. I mean, and to your point, it is strange in a way how something so large and loud can still feel carefully assembled, no pun intended, almost delicate in its construction, because you watch it unfold and you realize it isn't just about spectacle, even though spectacle is everywhere. The real trick, I think, here lies in balance. You have so many moving parts, so many personalities implied rather than stated, and yet it rarely collapses under its own weight. There is definitely a confidence to it, not an arrogance, but a sense that it knows exactly what it's trying to do, and it doesn't rush to prove itself. It takes its time, letting tension build, letting friction simmer, and trusting that the eventual release will land harder because of it. And when that release comes, it feels earned, not just loud for the sake of being loud. What I think stands out the most is the rhythm. Quiet moments aren't treated as filler. They matter, and they give space for ego and doubt and conflict to breathe. Without those pauses, the action would feel very hollow. With them, every clash carries a bit more meaning, even when the stakes are painted in broad, almost mythic strokes. And I think there's also a kind of playful self-awareness running underneath everything. It never takes itself too seriously, but it doesn't slip into parody either. It kind of walks that narrow line where humor sharpens the experience instead of undercutting it. And that's not easy to pull off, especially at this scale. And I think then there's the idea at its core that cooperation is, to your point, messy. That putting strong wills together doesn't create harmony right away. It creates noise and friction and resistance. And the film leans into that instead of smoothing it over. I think it does suggest that unity isn't about sameness, but about surviving disagreement long enough to become something functional. So by the end, I think what lingers isn't just the imagery or the scale, though those are hard to ignore. It's the sense of alignment, of something chaotic finding a temporary order. And you don't walk away thinking it's profound exactly, but you do feel like you've watched a machine click into place for the first time. And there is something very satisfying about that, something almost mechanical in its precision, even as everything on screen seems ready to fall apart. And to your point, yes, this was an incredibly iconic film for so many reasons and very much redefined the superhero genre. So let's get to our characters on the board, starting with two characters who will butt heads multiple times down the line. We have the aforementioned Chris Evans as Captain America and Robert Downey Jr. as Tony Stark, aka Iron Man. So what did you make of Cap and Iron Man in this one, Rachel?
Well, I mean, they butt heads almost immediately. That's the thing. It's just the interesting thing with these two characters, not just because their personalities seem to be diametrically opposed to each other. You know, Tony Stark famously is a partier. You know, he is flashy. He loves attention. You know, he is sarcastic. Yeah, he doesn't have a filter. And then you've got Captain America, who is supposed to be, you know, the epitome of everything good and right about America. You know, he's born out of war, in a way, you know, a time where unity against a force and an enemy so evil, like Hitler and the Nazi regime, that you know, it's, even though he's really started out as a propaganda piece, he eventually did become an actual hero, not just playing one on stage, but he's always kept the same personality he had even before he went through the transformation. And you know, in that movie, you know, Dr. Erskine even says, you know, that the serum enhances what's already there. So who Steve Rogers was pre-transformation, he still is post-transformation. He's polite. He's kind of old-fashioned in his way he, you know, acts with people, especially the opposite sex. You know, he doesn't use foul language. I mean, it's not until we get to Age of Ultron where he says shit. And, you know, Tony has to point out that it's like, oh, Steve said a bad word. You know, that's kind of the benchmark we use as far as the Five-ish Fangirls is concerned, as far as language. Unless it's a direct quote, we don't use any words that Captain America wouldn't use if we can help it. Because we do try to keep our show, you know, as family friendly as possible. And so it's like these two guys' personalities don't look like they should match or even, you know, get along well. But then they have something very, very important that connects the two of them that they can't deny, and that is Howard Stark. You know, Howard Stark was Tony's father, you know, literally, and in a way, he kind of is Steve / Captain America's father. You know, Howard Stark is kind of responsible for both of these guys existing. And, you know, as we've seen throughout the entries in the MCU, Howard was not the best father to Tony, but he seemed to be a pretty good friend to Steve. And I think maybe there's some already built-in resentment there. You know, when these two finally meet, you know, face to face, and after, you know, after they get a moment to actually, like, you know, talk and stuff, and, you know, one of the first things Tony says is, "This is the guy my dad would not stop talking about," which, you know, it's like, okay, you know, my dad was more excited to talk about this guy than his own actual flesh and blood son. But at the same time, those extreme personalities are almost what is needed and ultimately ends up what makes it work, because it almost becomes like a yin and yang type thing, where instead of being, you know, poles, you know, that are constantly, you know, pushing against each other and can't connect, instead they find ways to bring their strengths together, but still allow them to be themselves. But it takes quite a bit to get there. Even after this, you know, their relationship isn't, you know, they're not besties. Steve and Tony are not besties. They're not, Tony's got Rhodey, and Steve eventually, has Bucky back once Bucky returns. And they're their real BFFs, but they're work, quote unquote workplace family, I guess, as it were. And I mean, these two just embody these characters. I'm probably going to say this about every single character, actually. This person embodies this character so well, I don't understand how anybody else can play this character. For Chris, this was like, he'd already dipped his toe in the superhero thing, playing a version of the Human Torch in the 2 live-action Fantastic Four movies. But this is what, this brought Chris Evans to, a whole new level. And of course, he fits everything that Captain America is supposed to, he's tall, he's muscular, he's got the blonde hair and the blue eyes and the chiseled jaw, and he's just if he was food, he would be an apple pie. Captain America is kind of the equivalent of Superman as far as DC, the DC universe is concerned. Truth, justice, in the American way, and all that fun stuff. Chris thankfully has been very good about taking that and rolling with it. Thankfully, since then we've seen a lot of character growth with Steve Rogers, and now he's coming back. Or at least some version of Steve is coming back in Doomsday. We still don't know yet exactly how he fits in all of this. But we thought Chris was done after Endgame. Of course, he does make that appearance in Deadpool versus Wolverine, but he doesn't play Steve Rogers in that. And then you've got Iron Man, who is, I mean, as far as you're talking the quote unquote heroes, he is one of my absolute favorites. And I love the fact, and I don't know, even if this was not a conscious thing that Kevin Feige did, but you have to imagine that at least on a subconscious level, there was something tickling his brain. But the fact that Robert Downey Jr.'s real life story parallels Tony Stark's various adventures and life events in various storylines in the comic books, I don't think is accidental. Whether it, like I said, whether it was something conscious that Marvel, it was like, he, not just the fact that he looks like Tony Stark, although I'm glad that by the time we got to this, they'd done away with the real real nitpicky shaped goatee that he had going on in the first Iron Man. This is more natural. And I don't know, how much Robert may have known about the character before getting the role, or how much research he's done in the years since. But I think it's almost befitting that they kind of have these kind of parallel lives. And it's like, to steal from Wonder Man, it's almost like Robert Downey Jr. was born to play this role. And he does it so well. I mean, he's so charismatic and so cocky and sarcastic. And thankfully, by this point, he's not as much as a womanizer. He's with Pepper. They've got a good thing going there. She's been very good for him. And that and the not dying from the poisoning that was happening in his chest in the second Iron Man movie helped too. faced with his own mortality again. And yet he's so, it's obvious he cares. But it's that genius billionaire playboy philanthropist. Maybe not so much playboy anymore, but I'm sure he and Pepper made the tabloids a few times. He's so smart, and sometimes that ends up getting in his own way. But in this case, it is. What's funny is, talking about this again now that we're even further into the MCU and looking backwards, being able to be like, oh, that's that thing, or that connects to that, even if at the time they didn't necessarily, Marvel didn't necessarily know exactly what was going to tie into what, but I'm sure they had some idea, because a lot of the stuff that is put into these movies is not accidental. It's not just for fun. I mean, there are some just for fun Easter eggs always. And of course, we got a Stan Lee cameo. We can talk about that when we talk about the end. But it's wild to think that that Shield brought in somebody like Tony Stark, not just because the Iron Man suit obviously is a very valuable and usable weapon and tool, but they're also bringing in Tony for his intelligence, knowing that when he reads all those files that get brought to him, that he's going to absorb it and he's going to start thinking about, how can we get the Tesseract and all this stuff. But it also opens up Shield to a lot of scrutiny, because Tony is not very trusting. He trusts himself and maybe like two people, like Pepper and Rhodey, and that's probably about it. That's as far as Tony's trust goes. Everyone else, he could trust them as far as he can throw them without the suit. So it's not very far. And Shield inadvertently opens themselves up to a lot of scrutiny and analysis by bringing Tony in, and that ultimately lays the groundwork for bigger things to occur later down the line. And it's just kind of wild to think about the information that Tony was essentially Jarvis was hacking Shield's computers, the minute he got on the helicarrier, and the amount of information that Tony was sitting on that he probably never looked at. Like the whole Hydra being hidden within Shield, Tony probably could have exposed that years before it. His concern at that point was, what is phase 2? And then dealing with Loki, and then it was rebuilding Stark Tower, and just thing, and if his curiosity wasn't piqued, he wasn't going to look at it. And Jarvis isn't going to say anything unless Tony asks him, or Jarvis thinks it's relevant. So for whatever reason, Jarvis didn't mention to bring up the whole Hydra thing either. But it is kind of funny that that they brought in Tony Stark, even though at one point they flat out told him to his face that Iron Man, yes, part of the Avengers initiative. Tony Stark, no. But when push comes to shove, you need, with a situation like this, you need the best of the best, and that means bringing in not just the Iron Man suit, but the guy behind it, regardless of what it may mean as far as putting them under the Tony Stark microscope, as it were. And the fact that Steve ends up getting, picking up what Tony's putting down, it ends up doing his own reconnaissance, again, shows that even Steve is aware that just because S.H.I.E.L.D. is supposed to be the good guys, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're always going to make the best decisions. But again, knowing what we know now, I mean, we'll talk about Nick Fury, but knowing what we know now, the people that Nick Fury was answering to in this particular movie, they all ended up being Hydra. So
that is exactly it. In fact, it really changes the perspective, I guess, now that we know what we know for sure. And you bring up a great point there, Rachel, about Tony likely knowing about Hydra's infiltration of S.H.I.E.L.D., which, of course, we weren't aware of at this point. But I think what is interesting with these two characters is how differently the film treats them even before anything is said outright. Because, yeah, like we were saying with Cap, I think there is a sense of displacement. He feels like someone built for a clearer world, suddenly dropped into something louder and faster, and yes, morally messier. You can almost feel the friction how he observes everything, because he leans on structure, on hierarchy, on the idea that there's a right way to act, not because he's rigid for the sake of it, but because that's how he makes sense of chaos. And I think there's also a quiet loneliness to him. He doesn't quite belong even when he's trying to lead. And then you have Tony, who I agree exists at the opposite end of that spectrum, because he thrives in disorder. Rules are something to test, not follow. And where the other one looks for stability, this one seems energized by instability. I think there's a kind of deflection in him as well. Humor and arrogance and improvisation, it's all a way of staying in control without ever appearing to need control. And what I think makes their dynamic work is that neither is entirely right and neither is entirely wrong. One represents principle without flexibility, the other represents adaptability without grounding. And when they clash, it's not just personality, it's definitely worldview as well. But the film doesn't freeze them in opposition. It nudges them slowly toward recognition. Respect doesn't come from agreement. It comes from seeing what the other can do that you can't. And one learns that structure alone won't solve everything, and the other starts to understand that some things require commitment beyond impulse. So by the end, there is this subtle shift, not a full transformation, but a recalibration. They don't become the same, and that's the point. They become compatible. And that small adjustment is what allows everything else around them to hold together. And I certainly agree with you. I could not see anybody else at this point but Chris and RDJ playing these characters, even more so as we move forward in the MCU. So let's get to our God and our Rage Monster. We have the aforementioned Chris Hemsworth as Thor and Mark Ruffalo as, of course, Bruce Banner, the Hulk. So what did you make of these two?
Well, Thor had been more recently introduced to the MCU by the time we got to this point. And really, it's the events of Thor that are what feed into this, what ultimately our plot for this. It introduced, well, at the time, it introduces that there are people from other planets and creatures and beings with abilities and technology and magic and all this stuff that Earth has not been privy to before. Of course, we find out with Captain Marvel that Nick Fury actually already knew that. It's just that they really hadn't had to deal with anything like that since, Carol took off. He hasn't seen Carol in quite a while at this point. At least as far as we know. And, and the idea of Loki being our, antagonist in this, and, this first kind of mega, major battle is because Thor's brother is a jealous twit who has severe self-esteem issues. And Thor is, he'd only been on Earth the one other time, but found himself to enjoy it. Not just because Jane were had a little thing going on, but like he says in this, he considers himself like a friend. But unfortunately, he ends up getting cut off, which he'll end up inadvertently paying for that when he gets slapped in the face when he sees Jane and Darcy again. And but his time on Earth changed him, and he feels protective of it. And if it had been anybody but Loki, I don't think maybe necessarily Thor would have shown up. I think it had to be Loki. Again, it's one of those things where it's like, yeah, it just makes sense as far as what we've seen, as as far as character interaction and motivation and everything that's been established up to this point. It just makes perfect sense. And that gives an absolute obvious opening to bring Thor in. And Thor is the kind of outlier when it comes to the rest of the Avengers because he's not human. He's not of Earth. He's got this hammer that allows him to fly and generate lightning and all this stuff, and all the seemingly otherworldly things. Yet he comes from royalty, and he was very arrogant in his movie, and his experience in that helped temper that arrogance. But instead of being, he still has some arrogance. I mean, that scene right before kind of the shit explodes, literally, where they're arguing in the lab. And this is kind of the point of, this is what you're bringing all these characters together with all these different personality types. This is the standing around arguing, insulting, yelling at each other, just cacophony of personalities and egos coming together and clashing. And it's like, this is what we expected. This is like the most obvious outcome when you bring these this number and variety of people together. And at that point, Thor is still a bit arrogant. His arrogance still shines through. But it ultimately, what was arrogance is confidence, and he wants his confidence in the way he carries himself is different than Steve's, and it's different than Tony's, but it's that confidence in his abilities and the love he has for his brother, because for him this is very personal because it's his brother. And he does not want to see his brother destroyed. He wants him stopped. But at the end of the day, he does not want his brother destroyed. He's already thought his brother died once. He's going to think his brother died multiple times again before he actually does die. Or at least that version of him does ultimately die. But for the rest of them, it's like, oh my God, Earth is under attack. We got to save it. We got to protect it. For Thor, it's like, yes, it's Earth, it's this planet I've come to love, but it's my brother. Ultimately, I love my brother, and I want to see him thrive and be the brilliant individual I know him to be if he just get his head out of his own ass. Because Thor learned that lesson. He had to get his head out of his own ass. And once he did that, he realized what potential there was as far as life and opportunity and all that. And he's like, my brother could learn that same lesson. Imagine the team we could be, which we do see that in Ragnarok, actually. They do make it when they can team up properly together. They are a very good team. But for Thor, this is very personal. Then you've got Bruce / the Hulk. I think most people know at this point, Mark Ruffalo is now the third person in so many years to play a version of Bruce Banner / the Hulk. The obviously we have the Ang Lee version. We've had Eric Bana, we've had Edward Norton, The Edward Norton, the Eric Bana version, it's its own thing. Yeah. But obviously the Edward Norton version is canon as far as the MCU is concerned, because we have seen some of those characters come back even years later. Yeah, we've seen the Abomination come back. Yeah, we've seen Ross, Thunderbolt Ross become an important character. It's just they happen to change the actor that plays Bruce Banner, but they don't acknowledge it. It's just one of those things where, the actor changed, we're not necessarily going to acknowledge it. We might get a little sly wink and nod like they did with Rhodey, which now, where we are now, whew, they dodged a bullet getting rid of Terrence Howard.
Thank God for Don Cheadle.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good thing that Terrence Howard played hardball to the point where they just dropped him like a hot potato. And Don Cheadle was able to come in and just slide right in like he'd always been there. But like, if you've seen what Terrence Howard is up to now, whoo, they dodged a bullet. So they did the same thing with Bruce Banner. Yeah, it's a different actor. We're not going to acknowledge it. But we are going to acknowledge that this is, as far as the MCU is concerned, it's the same Bruce Banner Hulk that you saw that had been previously played by Edward Norton. He makes that comment. He's like, the last time I was in New York, I kind of broke Harlem. And that's exactly what he did. And I think Ruffalo, this is one of those things where it's like, even not necessarily in universe, it seems to be that sometimes with these characters, like third time's the charm. So, even if the Banner one is not part of the MCU, we're now on our third Bruce Banner Hulk. And I think they got it right. I think that Ruffalo brings that vulnerable, awkward, very nerdy scientist that Bruce Banner is. But when he is the Hulk as well, because that's all done with motion capture. So that is Mark Ruffalo's performance that we are seeing even when he's in Hulk form. He is, the Hulk is still very scary. He's very menacing. It's obvious that he is very dangerous, but you can also, and I think this is something that they missed with the previous versions, is the Hulk, as Tony likes to say, huge green rage monster. There's still a bit of humanity in there. And we do see that, again, as we go on, we see that with his relationship with Natasha. These two finally meeting in this movie, the fact that Natasha is the first person that he meets, and goes about how Bruce actually expected it to go. But their relationship is very important, even though it does not get to go and flourish into something like what Tony and Pepper ultimately have. His relationship with Natasha ends up being very important. And his relationship with Thor is actually very important as well. I think Ruffalo he is, when you have some of these characters where their hero, quote unquote hero identity is so different than who the person is that everybody seems to know, finding an actor that can do both is not easy. As far as Iron Man, Tony Stark, it's still Tony Stark with the suit on. He's still gonna be sarcastic and be impulsive and crack jokes. But with Bruce, you've got one personality. With the Hulk, you've got another, but there's also bits and pieces of the personalities within the other person, the other being. And Mark does a fantastic job of being able to play both and bring that balance. Again, we have been able to see him, develop that further and further as the MCU continued. Like I said, his relationship with Natasha, by Agent Ultron, is very important. Obviously, his relationship with Thor, we see in Thor Ragnarok, that ends up, being a big deal. And ultimately, the part he has to play in Infinity War and Endgame, and even post Endgame, as we see him with his appearances in the She-Hulk series, and now he's going to be back again in Spider-Man Brand New Day. So it'll be interesting to see what Bruce is up to now and how the Hulk may or may not play into things, not just with Spider-Man, because obviously Peter is approaching him as a scientist. Peter probably doesn't, if he knows that Bruce is the Hulk. I mean, most people probably do. But it seems like Peter's approaching him as Bruce Banner, the scientist and doctor, not big green rage monster. But how that also factors into Doomsday and beyond, whether Bruce is going to find himself in a situation where it's like, do we need Bruce Banner the scientist? Like they started out with this, but ultimately the big guy is going to be the one to come in and throw his weight around to help save the day. Don't know. It'll be interesting to see.
I'm sure we're definitely going to get a lot when it comes to Spider-Man Brand New Day and how things then move forward for sure. And I'm glad that, they of course, talk about Hulk, not just as the big green rage monster, but also as Bruce Banner, because I think here Mark kind of plays two characters. But, starting with Thor, I agree, there's an almost mythic weight to everything he does. He does carry himself like someone who comes from a world where power and identity are inseparable. There is pride there, but not the fragile kind. It's more like certainty, because he believes in who he is and in where he comes from, and in the idea that strength has a kind of built-in authority. At the same time, you can sense he's slightly out of step with the world around him. Not lost exactly, but kind of operating on a different frequency. And his perspective feels older and broader and less concerned with the small details everyone else gets caught up in. The whole comment of "you people are so petty and tiny" comes to mind. And then there's Hulk, who is kind of almost the inverse of that. Where one is defined by control and identity, the other is defined by the lack of both. Because he isn't just powerful, he's unpredictable in a way that makes everyone uneasy. And there is a tension in his very presence, like something could break at any moment. But beneath that volatility, there is a strange kind of restraint trying to exist. Not perfect restraint and not always successful, but an effort. And I think that's what makes him more than just chaos. Bruce himself is defined less by what he does and more by how carefully he avoids doing it. And he enters the story already shaped by years of fear and restraint. And so I'd say this is not an origin arc, it's definitely a control arc. And what I think stands out immediately is how self-aware Bruce is. He understands the danger he poses better than anyone else in the room. While characters like Tony approach problems with curiosity and confidence, Bruce approaches them with caution. Tony wants to test the limits. Bruce builds his life around not crossing them. And I think this contrast does highlight Bruce as someone who has already seen the worst case scenario and is quietly living in its aftermath. Also, I'd say there's a constant tension between how others perceive him and how he perceives himself. Natasha, initially treats him like a volatile threat, and that reaction reflects the wider world's fear of the Hulk. I mean, Bruce doesn't argue against it. In fact, he reinforces it. He sees himself as dangerous first, human second. And I think that internalized fear is central to his character. He isn't trying to prove he's safe. He's trying to avoid proving everyone right. I think the turning point comes with the idea that control isn't about suppression. His famous line about always being angry, I think, reframes everything. it does reveal that his calm demeanor isn't the absence of anger, but the management of it. So I guess psychologically, this does shift Bruce from being a victim of the Hulk to someone who has integrated that part of himself, at least partially. The Hulk, I think, stops being an external curse and becomes an internal force that can be directed. So, and also his interaction with Loki reinforces this theme. Loki tries to dominate him through fear and intimidation, assuming that Bruce is fragile. And instead, Bruce's response shows a kind of grounded resilience. He no longer denies the monster, he acknowledges it. And I think that acceptance strips Loki of power in that moment. And yeah, and by the Battle of New York, Bruce's arc reaches this quiet resolution. When Cap tells him to suit up, he doesn't hesitate. This is the clearest sign of growth. Because early in the film, the transformation is treated as failure. Here it becomes a deliberate choice. He isn't losing control, he's choosing when to let go. So overall, I would say that Bruce's role in the film is to explore the idea that true control doesn't come from denial or avoidance, but from acceptance. Because he does represent a different kind of strength compared to the other Avengers. Not charisma like Tony and not leadership like Steve, but restraint. His journey is definitely quieter and more internal and arguably more psychological. And by the end, he doesn't solve his problem, he learns how to live with it. And yeah, when Thor and Hulk collide, it's less about disagreement and more about raw force meeting raw force. There's no subtle philosophical clash like with the others. It's immediate and it's physical and it's almost instinctive. Strength recognizing strength, but without the need to understand it. And what I think is interesting, though, is how the film gradually reframes that unpredictability. What starts as a liability becomes something almost essential. The very thing that makes him dangerous is also what makes him effective, like you were saying. And the one who seems most stable and most assured is forced to adapt to that reality rather than control it. So together, I'd say these two represent two extremes of power. One refined and shaped by identity and history, and the other uncontained, still searching for a way to exist without tearing everything apart. And somewhere in that contrast, the film finds a kind of balance. Not by softening either of them, but by letting both exist as they are and still contribute to something larger. And they definitely work very well in this film. So let's get to our two humans on this team. We have Scarlett Johansson as Natasha Romanoff, aka Black Widow, and of course Jeremy Renner as Clint Barton, Hawkeye. So what did you make of Nat and Clint, Rachel?
Well, as I said, we'd already been introduced to these characters in previous films, so we knew what we were getting, at least to a point. I mean, they're human, but they're not just any human. I mean, they are members of S.H.I.E.L.D., which means they are the best at what they do, because that's what S.H.I.E.L.D. utilizes, is they take the best of the best, whatever that person's best thing is, and gives them more opportunity and resources to refine those skills, and opportunities to, in theory, do good. Obviously, eventually we learn that S.H.I.E.L.D. is not everything it's cracked up to be, and that doesn't even count the fact that Hydra is hiding underneath. But these two are, some of the best that S.H.I.E.L.D. has to offer in their ranks. At least when it comes to, fighting, espionage, spy work. They're the James Bonds, as it were. And obviously Natasha. We get a little bit of backstory when Loki thinks he's intimidating her. Where she's like, I made a name for myself. Barton was already with S.H.I.E.L.D. at that point and was set to assassinate her, take her off the board, but he decided to recruit her instead and give her a second chance. And obviously we learned a heck of a lot more about her backstory in the Black Widow movie. And we also learn a lot about the Black Widow program in the Black Widow movie. And also, we see the starts for anybody that may, for like the 5 of us that bothered to watch it, second season of Agent Carter, we see the starts of the Red Room. That is a little gave us there. And we see that Natasha was not kidding when she and Bruce meet initially. He's like, your old friend there. Did she start that young? And Natasha's like, well, I did. And then we see that later down the line. And the Clint and Natasha are, they're not just work colleagues though. They are BFFs. And it is love, but not in the way that Loki meant. I don't think it occurs to Loki that a man and a woman can love each other and it not be romantic. These two love each other like they are family. And as we learned in Age of Ultron, Clint has a wife. His romantic side is already spoken for. And as we learned in the Hawkeye series, his wife is a previous S.H.I.E.L.D. agent herself. So she gets it. And Natasha is considered part of their family because Natasha does not have her own family to speak of. As her parents are, who knows where at this point. Her sister is who knows where at this point. Again, we'll see that with the Black Widow movie. What I love, like I said, I love watching this movie over and over and over and over. And I usually can find something new, something maybe I didn't necessarily notice before. And a lot of times it's not anything that's necessarily important to the film or whatever. It's just, after a while you start looking at like backgrounds and stuff because you know exactly what's happening in the center of the screen. So it's like, oh, let me see what those people over there are doing. But after Age of Ultron, and we find out about Clint's wife and children, and they're rewatching this, and ever since, when Natasha is quote unquote interrogating those Russians or whatever those guys were, when we first see her in the movie, and Phil calls, at first she's all like, because Coulson's like, you need to come in. And she's like, I'm busy, interrogating this guy and he's giving me everything. And of course the guy's like, oh, but all Phil has to say is Barton's been compromised. 3 simple words. And headcanon, I think Phil knows that Clint is married and has, at this point, a kid, maybe. Because I don't know if this is necessarily for sure canon or if this is head canon, but in someone's mind somewhere I read, this is one of those things where I read something but I don't know where the person got that idea from, but supposedly at one point Phil was their handler within S.H.I.E.L.D. So to me it would make sense that Phil would know that he is one of the few people that knows that Clint is married and is a father, potentially. I'd have to look at the timeline and be like, would any of Clint's kids be born at this point, or is he just married? But when Coulson just says those 3 words, Clint's been compromised, and you see Natasha's face change. And at the time, you're just all like, well, yeah, she's a fellow agent. They're friends. She understands that having an agent be compromised is a big deal. And then she's like, let me push on hold. And then we have that fantastic fight scene. But knowing what we know now, to me, when Natasha's face changes from being kind of, smart alecky with Coulson to being way more serious, in my mind, Natasha's mind immediately goes to Clint's family. And she's like, holy shit, Barton's been compromised. If anything happens to him, only so many people know that his family even exists. And since she's the closest and, seems to be considered part of the family, as we see in Age of Ultron, in her mind, in my mind, in her mind, she's like, if anything happens to Clint, I have to be the one to go and tell his family. And she knows that, she'll do it if she has to, but she would rather make sure that Barton gets, gets collected, that he is whole and complete, so that she can send him back to his farm out in the middle of nowhere with the house that he never seems to be able to not do projects on with his wife, and know that he is going to be able to, sleep in his own bed, in his own house, with his wife, on his property, instead of being a victim to whatever the hell is starting to go down that she's not fully, been informed about yet. And I doubt at that point that was a direction that they were going to go as far as Clint and Natasha's relationship. That we're going to find out Clint's married with kids and has a house and a farm out in the middle of nowhere. And Natasha's been aware of it the entire time, to the point where she's considered Aunt Nat to his kids, and she thinks that the last baby is going to be named after her because it's supposed to be a girl. I doubt they knew that back when this movie was made, so I don't think necessarily that that's the motivation that Scarlett Johansson was necessarily using, and that's the kind of the emotional weight that kind of sits there when she and Clint are having their scenes together later, after she's cognitively recalibrated him. But I think they're just, I don't know, maybe if it was something intuitive, or it's just something that Scarlett just kind of got as the character, even at that point. It's such a subtle thing, and you could interpret it a number of ways, probably based on what you know of the character. But I don't know what the direction was. Yes, Joss Whedon did help write the script. He did direct this. It's a fantastic directing job, but the less we talk about Joss Whedon, the better. He is on the shit list with a number of other people for very good reasons. It's again, it's one of those things where it's like we're so far beyond this now, and have so much more of this canon and information that's been given to us, that it makes you look at these characters and interpret their actions and their body language and the way they say things differently. And like I said, I don't think they knew exactly all these very fine details that we know now then, but I think that just goes to show just how well when they decided to bring these particular characters in and have them interact with each other in these various ways, that the powers that be recognized that the potential that these characters could be very, very well-rounded characters, not one note, and give us characters that we, love to hate in some cases, love to love, hate to love, depends on your preference. Give us these characters that we can become emotionally invested in without having to tell us everything all at once. They knew they were playing the long game, but they were able to develop these characters in a way that they're like, okay, I know like 3 things about this person, but I don't care. I'm here for it. I'm going to cheer for them. I'm going to cry for them. If and when they die, because this is comic book, land, people are going to die, but everybody stays dead. I'm going to mourn their passing. And I think with you really see that with these two characters in particular. I think because they are human, they're not enhanced. They don't, yeah, they got some cool toys, but nothing like the Iron Man suit. They're not enhanced with super soldier serum or anything like that. They're not demigods. But having these two people be the best of the best, some of the best that Shield has to offer, yet so human and their humanity, I think is what really draws us in, so that even after this is over, we still want to hang around being like, okay guys, what's next? Yeah. And they continue to be part of it. Even as characters come and go and the group expands, this is the OG team. And they continue to be the OG team until the end with Endgame. And I just, it's like, you see like Thor throwing around his, the hammer with the lightning, and Steve has got the shield and everything. And of course, Tony's got the suit, and the Hulk is big green rage monster. And, Hawkeye is fantastic with all his different arrows that can do different things. And I think it's absolutely fantastic. And I love the way that, he's just so confident about the way he shoots without having to look sometimes. And he knows exactly, he knows his equipment inside and out, knows exactly what he's doing. Like when he shoots that arrow at Loki after Loki has left the tower and is now riding on with one of the Chitauri, and he shoots that arrow, knowing full and well that it is not going to actually pierce Loki. Like he knows Loki, even without being mind controlled. Like he's fought enough bad guys in his time. He knows like this type of personality, this type of ego. He's like, I'm gonna shoot this, and this guy is just gonna pluck it out of the air and be like, boo to you. You thought you were gonna hit me with your little arrow, not knowing. And because of Loki's arrogance, and Clint knows this, that Loki is not going to think the fact that, an arrow can do things other than just pierce something. Like, the head can explode. Oh, yeah. And Natasha, she's got pistols, which in the grand scheme of things is like, kitty toys compared to everybody else. She's really good with them. And she does have the Black Widow bites, although she never really gets to use them in this, which kind of sucks. But, she's very smart. That's the thing. She is well aware of the fact that she is a woman, and a good-looking woman is a blessing and a curse. But she is smart enough to know when to take advantage of that assumption, as we see with the interrogation at the beginning, and when to use, and use that to her advantage. But there are also other advantages that come with her being female that give her strengths that the other Avengers don't, because they're not built like her. Pretty much everybody else is all muscle. It's all different types of muscle, but it's a lot of muscle and testosterone. What she's got is a very she's strong, but she's not muscular, but she's also very flexible. She had gymnastics and classical ballet training as part of her training in the Black Widow program. So she is also very lithe and has the ability to move very quickly, which we see that, when she decides to, hitch her ride with one of the Chitauri. And then we see that when she dismounts to land on right there on Stark Tower. She lands and does this, very cool looking roll, and pops back up like, okay, let's go.
And of course then gets teased for it by her sister later down the line. But I very much agree with you there, Rachel, because with Natasha, I think everything is built on control, but it's a different kind of control than the others. It's definitely quieter and more internal, because she doesn't dominate a space, but she reads it. Every interaction feels measured, like she's always a step ahead. even when she appears vulnerable. And there is a sense that identity for her is something literally flexible, almost negotiable, because she can shift and adapt and become what the moment requires. But that adaptability comes at a cost. You do get the feeling that underneath all that precision, there is a question of who she is when she's not performing. And we do get an idea about that later in later shows and movies. And then there's Clint, who definitely feels more grounded and more human in a very direct way, because he doesn't have the same layers of masks. I mean, what you see is closer to what you get. There is a steadiness to him, a kind of reliability that doesn't need to announce itself. Even when he's pulled out of alignment, there's still a sense that he belongs to something real, something personal. He's not defined by spectacle or myth, he's defined by connection. And what I think ties these two together is history, but not the kind that needs constant explanation. It is implied in the way they move around each other, in the trust that exists even when circumstances distort it. To your point, the famous phone call that Natasha gets early on in the movie. And their bond feels earned and not constructed for the moment. And that definitely makes the tension involving them land differently. It's not just conflict, it's disruption of something that already mattered. And compared to the others, they do operate on a smaller scale, but that's exactly their strength. While everything else is loud and world-shaking, they bring it back to something intimate. You have loyalty and debt and redemption, and their story isn't about learning to work together. It's about holding on to something that already exists and trying not to lose it. So I would say that in a film full of big personalities and clashing ideologies, they're the quiet center. Not because they're less important, but because they remind you, as you were saying, what all the noise is actually protecting. And it is also a great POV for us regular humans, I suppose. So speaking of humans, let's get to two prominent members of S.H.I.E.L.D. We have the aforementioned Samuel L. Jackson as director Nick Fury, and your personal favorite, Rachel, I know, Clark Gregg as Agent Phil Coulson. So what did you make of these two?
Well, yeah, as I said, the Nick Fury we see is the Nick Fury from the comic books around that same era, because they did design the more modern Nick Fury to look like Samuel L. Jackson with his blessing. And when you have an organization like S.H.I.E.L.D., which in itself is historical, again, helped founded by Howard Stark and Peggy Carter, and has been around quite a while. But to have an organization like that, you have to have somebody who, is, when they walk in the room, you're like, oh, this is the authority figure. This is the guy in charge. This is the guy that, commands respect, but also will give respect if it, in return. And, obviously runs his organization, with a precision that could almost envy the military, but not to the point where he doesn't allow flexibility. And Samuel L. Jackson absolutely does a fantastic job of towing that line of Nick Fury being that formidable authority figure. He's so, with his height and his build, and with the with the leather coat and everything, and even the eye patch, makes him look more badass. That he walks in the room and you're like, this, whatever this guy's got to say, I'm listening. But he also can have some humor. I think that's something that they don't necessarily. I think some people don't give Samuel L. Jackson enough credit for. So it can be funny. There's some great moments in this. His bet with Steve, that he's like, I bet you I could show you something that would blow your mind. And Steve's like, I doubt it. And then he sees the helicarrier and he immediately just pulls out the 10 and gives it to Fury. And Fury's like, Yep, it sticks in his pocket. You know, even though technically he is the director of Shield, unfortunately there is still people higher authority than him. There's the council, and but they're they're the suits, as it were. They're not the ones actually getting out there and facing the enemy head on and taking shots, being shot at, while you're shooting. These guys just, they sit in their cushy offices or wherever, collecting a paycheck and, enjoying all the power that they have. And he butts heads with them, even though technically those people outrank him and can, as we see, override his orders. So they have power that can overpower him. And he is totally aware of that. And you can see why he just by looking at them, it's like, that's old white people in suits. It's like, it's like, I get why he doesn't like bureaucracy. It's like, he's a man of action. As we've seen, he's, and we see in this too, he does do a lot of ordering and talking to people, but he also literally pulls out a grenade launcher and takes out one of his own planes. Thinking that he is stopping, catastrophe, and it turns out that was a decoy, and then he ends up pulling out his pistol, which I always thought was hilarious. Every time I think it's hilarious. I'm like, really, Nick, what were you going to do with that? What were you going to do with that pistol compared to that plane? What did you think you were going to I know I was the only thing he had on him at the time, because he'd use his one shot with a grenade launcher, but still. But as Tony says, he's not just a spy, he's the spy. And unfortunately, he's not, as director of S.H.I.E.L.D., he's not just sitting around waiting for something to happen, because now he knows shit can happen. Not just the incident with Thor and, and the Destroyer and everything that happened in that movie, but as we see in Captain Marvel, what happened all the way back in the 90s when he was a director of S.H.I.E.L.D., but was part of S.H.I.E.L.D., along with Coulson, with meeting Carol and learning about the Skrulls and the Kree and creatures from space, the planets, and all that stuff, and Flurkins. We learned how Fury ended up having to wear that eye patch. He says in a later movie, he's like, last time I trusted someone, I lost an eye, and it's like, yeah, you trusted a cat from outer space. That's why you lost that eye. One thing they did that they forgot to mention, a little side tangent. One thing they did forget to mention that would have, I think, helped explain things better in Captain Marvel is the Flurkin. Their scratches can be poisonous. So, you never want a cat to scratch your eyeball. You just don't want to scratch your eyeball, but let alone by a cat. But in this case, with Goose, is not a cat, it's a Flurkin, and that therefore it was going to cause more damage to Nick's face and eyeball than just normal cat scratch. Which is something I think they should have maybe explained a bit more. But whatever. It's still kind of funny. It's like, Nick Fury wears that badass eye patch because of a space cat. But Nick, as much as I think the phase 2 is partially because he has seen what is possible, what kind of threats Earth can face based on his own actual experience. But also, I think some of it is because of the council. It's breathing down his neck, and he's like, well, we got to do something. And so they start working on the phase 2. But even he says later, it's like, I wasn't going to put all my chips into that one basket with the phase 2 weapons. It's like, the Avengers initiative, that's really where I thought we should, put our support behind. It's like, it's not, you know, all the best weapons in the world aren't going to do you shit if you don't have people to use them. So it's like you need the best people, and that's what he was trying to do with the Avengers Initiative. And ultimately, he was right. It cost him some things, and as we learn later, he had every right to be wary and combative when it came to the council and their decision making. You know, I quote this movie a lot. And, you know, Nick Fury has some of the best lines in this movie. You know, is the sun up? Put it on the left. But, you know, his line to the council is like, I recognize the council's decision, but considering it's a stupid ass decision, I've elected to ignore it. I love that. It's like, considering it's a stupid ass decision, I've elected to ignore it. I use it a lot. And as we learn later, his mistrust in them was not completely unfounded. There may, you know, not just bureaucracy, but maybe on a gut level, he just recognized that there was something there that he should not put, you know, all of his support behind when it came to the council's decisions, and that's because they turned out to all be Hydra. So, you know, good for you and your gut instincts, Nick Fury. That and bureaucracy is just stupid sometimes. But there are people within S.H.I.E.L.D. that he knows he can trust, that they have proven themselves. And he knows that he can go to them with a task or a request or something, and he knows that, you know, he knows that they will do it. They won't do it blindly. They will, you know, speak up. They have no problem speaking up if they, you know, think that maybe he is making a decision for the wrong reasons, or, you know, not coming from the best place or whatever, due to misinformation. Hill is one of those. You know, we don't want to not mention Maria Hill. Yeah, she's not a major character as far as the MCU is concerned, but she plays her part. I think they did her dirty in Secret Invasion, but, you know, whatever. It is what it is, unfortunately. But I think she's a great character. Obviously, with Clint and Natasha, Fury trusts them as well. Obviously, Fury, if he did have an issue with Clint's decision to not assassinate Natasha, but to bring her in instead, if he had any issues with that, he obviously changed his mind and accepted the decision that Clint made. So, you know, he's got that going for him, showing that he's got a good, you know, it's a sign of a good leader, can recognize good, you know, have good people to have around you as a team. And Coulson is another part of that. Coulson is a very new S.H.I.E.L.D. agent in Captain Marvel. You know, still very wet behind the ears, but very eager. Obviously, Coulson is introduced to us in the very first Iron Man movie. And, you know, Coulson would pop up again. He plays a bigger part in Thor. And ultimately, and unfortunately, at least at the time, Coulson gets to kind of be the sacrificial lamb, as it were, that helps give the Avengers the push they need to get their shit together and figure out how to stop Loki. You know, I come to really like Coulson at that point. And, you know, when Loki goes and stabs him in the back, I can't say I was a fan. And I didn't like being reminded of it when Loki has to be reminded of some of his worst moments in the first season of Loki, because that's one of the things that they bring up. Like all the bad things you've done. That's like one of the first things they show is him stabbing Coulson. Thankfully, Coulson, while he dies, doesn't stay dead. At least not, you know, permanently at that point, he gets to come back for Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., which is canon. That's a whole other shoebox that I can get on, but I'm not going to get on that right now. But yes, Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. is canon. Anyone that tries to tell you otherwise is not paying attention to the details. That's all I'm saying. Send an email if you want more info. But yeah, no, Coulson is like my ride or die. When it comes to MCU characters that are not like the heroes, big air quotes, Coulson is my favorite. I think Clark Gregg just, he, for being seemingly such a minor character starting out, it was a character they brought in that was able to name drop S.H.I.E.L.D. to give the idea that S.H.I.E.L.D. exists. In this universe that they have started to build, and they just kept bringing him back and giving him more to do. I mean, there's there's a handful of one shots, and he's in a couple of them. Funny Thing Happened on the Way to Thor's Hammer and The Consultant. Both of those are little one shots that he appears in, he just I think. Maybe it was somewhat, fan response to him, and also just how well Clark got along with everybody else and how much people enjoyed having him around. They just, expanded the character to the point where, he plays such a pivotal role in this movie. I love Clark Gregg so much. The man is a huge nerd, among other things. He's a fanboy in his own right. I think that helps. I think that helped when he finally got to meet, when Phil finally gets to meet Captain America in real life, as far as the MCU is concerned. And he's just like, you can just tell he's, anybody that's ever been to a fan convention and got to meet a celebrity you really love and managed to keep your composure, unlike me, who burst into tears the first time I met Colin Baker and forgot how to speak the first time I met Weird Al. Anyone that's had a celebrity experience and managed to keep your composure, knowing full and well that on the inside you are just like, an absolute pot of emotions ready to boil over at any second, you can just tell Coulson is having that same experience from talking to Steve. And I think probably some of Clark's real life fanboy helped play into that. And his it's awkward talking. It's like, I was there. I watched you while you were sleeping. I mean, I was there when you were conscious, and him trying to coyly be like, you sound like Captain America training first. I mean, whenever I get to meet Clark Gregg, it'll probably be a similar experience, actually. I've been very fortunate to have met a number of people that are in the MCU. I've lost track at this point, but it's double digits. But Clark is one that I have not accomplished yet, and the one art piece I have that I've been collecting signatures on for years is starting to get really, really full. Granted, some people's signatures are on the bigger side, although Michael Rooker did not have to take up as much space as he did, but the man was at least one sheet to the wind at that point, and I wasn't going to argue with Yondu. But I've got a spot that every time I collect an autograph and they're like, I place it in front of them and they're like, where'd you like me to sign? I'm like, pretty much anywhere you want except for here. And it's right on Captain America / Steve Rogers' face. And they're all like, oh, are you saving that for Chris? And I'm like, no, that is for Clark Gregg. It's like, I've got a number of the cast of Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. and they get it when I'm like, no, this is for Clark. They're like, no, I totally get it. So it's not if, it's when. But Clark Gregg is my white whale when it comes to MCU autographs and fan meeting experiences that I have yet to check off. And I've even met Stan Lee, so that's saying something.
I was going to say, you met Stan the man himself, so it's like, yeah, well, hopefully that particular space will eventually at last be filled and you'll complete that particular side of your fandom indeed, Rachel, because I do know, I said, how much this character means to you and how much you're a big fan of Clark Gregg's. You know, with these two characters, they're interesting for various reasons. Starting with Nick Fury, everything feels calculated about this guy. You know, he's not just reacting to events, he's shaping them. Sometimes from the shadows, sometimes right in front of everyone. And there is a willingness in him to cross lines or at least blur them if it means getting a result. And you do get the sense that he carries the weight of the bigger picture at all times. And that weight justifies decisions that others might hesitate over. You know, trust for him is not freely given. It's managed and distributed carefully, almost strategically. And yet, there is something else underneath that pragmatism. He does believe in the idea of what he's building, even if he doesn't fully trust the people involved to get there cleanly. And that belief, I think, is what drives him to push and to provoke and even to manipulate when necessary. You know, he's less interested in harmony and more interested in outcome. Whereas Phil Coulson is the complete opposite. He very much operates on a very different wavelength, you know, where Nick deals in strategy, the other carries something closer to sincerity. Because he believes in people in a way that feels almost old-fashioned. Not blindly, but earnestly. And there is a quiet pride in him, not in power, but in being part of something larger than himself. And he doesn't need to control the room. He just needs to do his part in it. And what I think makes him stand out is that he bridges the gap between the extraordinary and the everyday. Because he sees the same larger-than-life figures everyone else does, but he responds to them with a kind of grounded admiration and not intimidation. And I think that perspective humanizes the whole operation. It very much reminds you that beneath all the scale and spectacle, there are still individuals making choices. And, you know, together, I think they form an interesting contrast because one builds the structure and makes the hard calls and keeps everything moving forward no matter the cost, whereas the other gives that structure meaning, even if he isn't the one steering it. And in a quiet way, it's the second presence that validates the first. You know, without that sense of belief, all the strategy in the world would feel very empty. And by the end, their connection does leave a mark that lingers longer than you might expect. Not because it's loud, but because it reframes everything around it. It does give purpose to decisions that might otherwise feel cold, and it reminds you that even in the world of grand plans, these small acts of faith still matter very strongly. So let's round off our characters with our main villain, who we have alluded to throughout the course of this review. We have Mr. Tom Hiddleston as Loki. So what did you make of this guy, Rachel?
Oh, goodness. What do you make of Loki? He's a bad boy that every girl thinks, oh, I can fix him. The thing with Loki and with Thor, and you kind of touched upon this earlier, Nick, is comparatively to our other characters where their origins are, or you know, they come from the comic book, except for Coulson. Coulson actually was an original character created for the movies and now is in the comic books because Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. have their own runs in the comic book. So it kind of went the opposite direction. But these are all comic book characters. That's where they come from. Loki and Thor are much older. They come from actual mythology. I mean, yeah, they're comic book characters, but even in the comics, they're pretty much based on the Norse legends of Thor and Loki and Odin and all of that, all of that amazing folklore that comes from that part of the world. If you've not looked into like the Norse mythology and everything, you really should. It's absolutely it's beautiful and breathtaking and so just amazing as far as storytelling is concerned. And in a way, Thor and Loki are almost aware of their origin and how people are aware of who they are, even if they don't realize that they're actual beings. Like in the MCU, like the Norse mythology exists, but it's based on beings that actually do exist. At some point their presence became known and stories started getting passed around, and now, at least on Earth, there's this part of the world where they have a whole folklore and civilization essentially built around these stories. Loki very much lives up to his reputation as the trickster. And the thing is we in the Thor movie, we learn that that Loki is adopted. Which, considering how much Thor looks like both his mother and father, it's like that probably tracks. I don't know how maybe they didn't figure that out beforehand, or maybe they just assumed that that Loki is Odin's son, but maybe he's not Freya's. That they just assume that Odin did the thing that a lot of kings do and had a mistress and had a son or something. But how it never occurred to them, maybe Loki's adopted, I don't know. But it works for this, I guess. And Loki, was found and brought into this family, and was treated like a prince because he was brought into a royal family. And while Thor was being older party on frat boy Thor, Loki was learning, especially with Freya, learning about magic and everything. And he wants nothing more than approval, but as we see, Odin is not father of the year by any means. For him to give approval to anybody about anything, you'd have better luck, using the philosopher's stone to turn something into gold. But Loki's got, it's like, it almost seems like his reaction when he learns about his true origin in the Thor movie, it seems like it's a bit overblown, all things considering. And I think in a way it is. I think Loki has always just kind of had this kind of chip on his shoulder for some reason. Maybe it was on a subconscious level. He knew he didn't, he technically didn't fit in, or, air quotes, fit in, or didn't belong, or whatever. I don't know. You could easily go down this path of nature versus nurture, I guess. The fact that that's really a frost giant, as far as genetics are concerned, that he was predisposed to whatever. Who knows? And it makes it even more complicated once we learn about Hela, which I love, because when we see baby Loki rescued by Odin, and we see he looks like the frost giants, he's got the blue skin and everything, but then when Odin is holding him, he's a baby, so I'm sure it's on a subconscious level, but he subconsciously alters his look so that he looks more like the type of not human, but humanoid, more humanoid looking being
More
that Odin
Asgardian.
is. As Guardian. Yeah. So it's more humanoid looking as opposed to the blue skin. And it's like, if he had the ability to change how he looks, why didn't he make himself have fairer hair and tanner skin so that he would look more like Thor and more like Freya, who has beautiful blonde hair? My headcanon is when Odin held little baby Loki and he looked into his eyes and this baby's looking at him and looks into his eyes. My headcanon is that while Odin was he had Thor, because Thor is older, so he had a kid, but as he's, gets the idea to save this baby, he's thinking of Hela, and you look at how Hela looks, pale, dark hair, wears a lot of green. I think baby Loki subconsciously was imprinting on Hela in Odin's mind, and that's why he looks the way he looks. And in turn, he didn't know it at the time, but it would make him stand out from the rest of his family. And I think maybe on a subconscious level that did something to him. So growing up, Thor is like, when he and Thor reunite in this movie and he's like, I thought you dead. And he's like, did you mourn me? And he's like, it's like, yes, and it's like, you're my brother. We grew up together. We played together. Thor has these memories of, a childhood with his little brother, having fun and, probably writing creatures, and playing out in the fields and learning to fight with weapons and, all the stuff that happens when you're royalty, demigod, I guess. Prince. But I think the circumstances of the way Loki was found and the secrets and everything that Odin was holding on to and is still holding on to even when we get to this point, and eventually, the whole thing with Hela comes to light in Ragnarok. That it did something to him psychologically. And it's a bit cliche, but they are royalty. So I guess therapy isn't really a thing that really happens. Is Loki really going to use some therapy? They all pretty good use some therapy, but that's just something you don't do. You don't see very much in royalty in general, both in fiction and non-fiction. But Loki has a lot of just resentment and ego and desperation for acknowledgement that yes, he is smart, he is talented, he is capable, and could be a leader. But since nobody's doing that, he's like, well, I'm just going to force a leadership role. I'm going to force my way into one. And it is with help. I mean, he all the crap that went down in the Thor movie, but he's even with his abilities, there's only so much he can do. So when he comes across an ally, I'm going to use that term very loosely because as we ultimately find out who that person is, it's not an ally. He's being used as a tool, but it works and it gives him what he wants, so he's okay with it. Because at this point, that's the type of person that Loki is. If it gets him what he wants, damn the consequences that may happen after. So it's like, I got to make a deal with the devil. I will make a deal with the devil. And, when the bill comes due, to quote another MCU movie, we'll deal with it. But until then, I'm getting what I want. So on everybody else. And he's given an opportunity and he's like, damn it, I'm taking it. And we even see once the Chitauri start to arrive and, New York is being destroyed and the Avengers are doing their best. And Thor confronts him again, and he's like, look at this. You really think that all this destruction and mayhem and everything that you'll be able to, you open Pandora's box. You really think you're going to be able to close it again and, sit on it and be like, I'm in charge now? No, too late. And Thor doesn't realize it at the time, but he's absolutely right. That this, while the Battle of New York does get won, it is a start of something so much bigger that we will get to 6-7 years down the line. And you can even see on Loki's face that he's all like, yeah, you can just kind of see, you get that look on his face of like a child that has done something very impulsive, not thinking about the consequences, and now they're seeing the consequences and going, oh shit. But he's not gonna, that would be too vulnerable for him to be like, to be like, look at his brother and be like, yeah, you know what, Thor, you're right. I effed this up. Let me help you see if we can fix this. He's not going to do that. That's just not his nature. That's too vulnerable. That's too open. He's not going to do that. So he's all like, you know what? Damn the consequences. It is what it is. There's nothing you can do about it. Sorry, sorry's your uncle. It's your problem now. And thankfully, at least somewhat, he does get some comeuppance. I'm sure, Sam was here, she'd be like, I always love a comeuppance story. And he does get a little bit of his comeuppance when the Hulk decides to play him like a rag doll, which is absolutely, that goes to show the difference between somebody like Loki and somebody like Bruce / the Hulk. While the Hulk, yes, is very dangerous, because there's still that humanity built in there from Bruce. It allows him to be able to make more conscious decisions. Some of it is just mindless green rage monster, but it's not always mindless. Sometimes, the mind is able to pop in and be like, hey, let's do this. But in this case, he's all like, it kind of lets the mindless part take over, especially when Loki's yelling at him. And I think the Bruce part of the Hulk's brain was all like, you know what, whatever, just show him who's boss. And that's ultimately what he does by smashing him. It's so funny. This is absolutely hilarious scene. And ultimately Loki in this timeline does go back to Asgard to face consequences for his actions. And we do see some of that with Thor: The Dark World. And ultimately it takes a lot of time, and it's not necessarily like, oh my god, this took forever for Loki to finally get some sort of growth. It's just the nature of the MCU. You can only make a movie so fast, and they got to make them in a way that makes sense, for the bigger story that they're trying to tell. But they, eventually Loki does finally. I mean, there's always going to be the tricky, sneaky part of him. Like Thor tells that story about how he turned himself into a snake and then scare him. And stuff like that. But ultimately Loki does finally kind of figure it out. And ultimately does do the right thing. Not necessarily the right thing, but the noble thing, I should say. It's not necessarily right, because I don't know if you can necessarily like argue right, wrong, smart, dumb, noble, definitely. He ultimately does make the noble choice to be the kind of the one to, at least buy Thor and all the Asgardians time when Thanos shows up. The bill does come due for Loki. Loki inadvertently kind of started this whole thing with Thanos. So it makes sense that way down the line that he would lose his life at the hands of Thanos. But it's doing the noble thing. But we have a long way before we get to that. The Loki we have in this movie is still very immature, which is saying something considering they're hundreds of years old at this point. I think by the time we get to Infinity War, I think Thor says that he's like 600 years old, 900 years old, something like that. You can imagine that Loki is something similar. But you could also say that change that we ultimately see in the Loki in Infinity War starts with this, and him seeing the consequences of his actions with the Battle of New York because of the Loki we see develop in the series. That is a Loki that escapes from Stark Tower with the Tesseract in Endgame. So I think there's maybe something to be said that, while he ultimately loses and still has a lot of time before we get some really obvious significant character growth and change, that this moment, the Battle of New York, with that, everything that happens in this, there's something that maybe flips a switch or ignites a little something inside of Loki, and it just kind of depends on which timeline you're following, how long it takes to manifest itself. Which in itself, I think, is a very interesting character analysis, because we have, at least two versions of Loki that we know really well now. That we're introducing Thor, we have as our kind of main antagonist in this, and then depending on which way you go, if you continue down through the Infinity Saga, we have that Loki, or you follow the Loki that escapes with the Tesseract in that timeline and goes to the TVA and everything, and where he ultimately ends up by the end of season 2 of Loki, which will probably have some not necessarily consequences, but some ripple effects that we have yet to see in the greater MCU. So it's like, comparatively, the Battle of New York is almost small change comparatively to what we're going to have, what we've seen since and what we still have coming. But the fact that Loki is still so much part of it, I think, is pretty awesome for the character. I think it's pretty awesome for Tom. Again, they couldn't have known that all the way back in 2012. This is where this is going to go. And obviously the stuff with Loki, especially season 2, that was also out of necessity because of the stuff that happened with an actor who shall not be named because they've been disgraced and pushed way in a corner. So the plot lines had to change. But the fact that it's still Loki, but now, as far as like that is concerned, it's still a redeemed Loki, but for a completely different reason. But both of those Lokis, kind of that epicenter, kind of that point in the road where it's one of those like locked, like the Battle of New York, to quote, to steal from Doctor Who, the Battle of New York is like one of those fixed points in time. Like the Battle of New York had to happen. But what happened because of the Battle of New York and the fallout from that didn't necessarily have to go a certain way. And that's now why we have Loki going one way, Loki going another, but ultimately, at least for those two timelines, Loki does get his redemption. And I think that's brilliant storytelling. Even if it's not necessarily what they intended, like I said, there's stuff that happened that characters had to bye-bye, at least for a little while. Maybe they'll get recast at some point. I wouldn't be upset with that. But where we are now, I think, considering the Loki we have in this, I think it's it's one of those hindsight things where it's like, damn, we've gone a long way, and I love every second of it. I can't wait to see where we're going next.
I totally agree with you. Yes, great storytelling for the now God of Stories, and it is fascinating on how far Loki has come since this. But in this particular one, I think there is a constant tension with this character between performance and truth. He moves through the film like someone who's always putting on a show, but not just for others. It feels like he's performing for himself as well, trying to hold together this image that keeps slipping. And at first glance, it is all control. He does speak as if he already knows the outcome, and as if everything is part of a design only he fully understands. And there is an elegance in the way he carries himself, in the way he manipulates situations and people, but that control never feels stable. It feels asserted and almost forced, like something he has to keep proving over and over again, to your point, Rachel. And what I think makes him interesting is that his desire for power doesn't come across as simple ambition. It does indeed feel personal. There is a need behind it, something tied to recognition, to being seen in a way he believes he hasn't been. And that's where the performance starts to crack, because the more he insists on dominance, the more it hints at insecurity underneath. And he stands apart from the others because he isn't trying to belong to the group or even coexist with it. He defines himself against it. Where they struggle toward cooperation, he rejects it entirely, because control for him means separation. It means standing above rather than alongside. And yet, there is, I agree, a kind of fragility in that stance, because his plans rely on others reacting in predictable ways, on fear and division holding steady. And when that begins to falter, so does the image that he's built. And the confidence doesn't disappear, but it starts to feel thinner, like it can't fully support the weight he's placed on it. And by the end, I think what lingers isn't just the idea of a villain seeking power. It's the sense of someone trying to define themselves through domination because they don't know how to do it any other way. And that's what gives him definitely a bit more dimension. Not enough to excuse what he does, but enough to make it feel rooted in something more human than it first appears. And Tom does a fantastic job, as always, portraying this character. And once again, it is wonderful seeing how this character's arc has changed and evolved throughout the course of the movies and the TV shows. So let's get to how this movie ended. Of course, the Avengers work together to protect New York from the Chitauri. The Hulk incapacitates Loki, while Natasha learns from Selvig, now freed from Loki's mind control, that Loki's scepter can shut down the generator. Fury's superiors from the World Security Council attempt to end the invasion by launching a nuclear missile at Midtown Manhattan. Of course, Tony intercepts the missile and flies it towards the Chitauri fleet through the wormhole. The missile destroys the Chitauri mothership and disables their forces on Earth. Tony becomes unconscious and his suit loses power, leaving him free falling towards Earth. The Hulk manages to catch him and the Avengers resuscitate him. And while Natasha uses Loki's scepter to close the wormhole. And in the aftermath, Thor transports an imprisoned Loki and the Tesseract to Asgard, where Loki will face justice for his crimes. Then we get a mid-credits scene where the Other confers with his master about the failed attack on Earth. And of course, then is revealed that this person he's talking to is indeed Thanos. And then, of course, we get our post-credit scene where our Avengers are enjoying some downtime with shawarma. So what did you make of how our movie ended, Rachel?
I mean, it's I mean, the good guys had to win. They just had to. This is the culmination of all the movies leading up to this. It's the first time the Avengers are coming together. This big battle of New York, and it's like they had to win. It's like, there was no point. They could have losses later, but for the first go round, they had to win, and win seemingly outright. Do they walk away unscathed? No, absolutely not. We see the consequences from this, not just with Thanos, but we see the consequences from this throughout the MCU. And are still seeing the consequences of this, in the MCU. A lot. Like I said, this is a fixed point in time, but from there it splinters off into various timelines, and even within those timelines, different characters have their different stories. Because like Phil technically dies, but is brought back, and goes on to do the series Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. There are crossovers with the movies with Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. Like I said, it is canon up to a point, but then you can start getting into the whole multiverse timeline thing, so you can still make it work, even as you get into the end there. And there's still a version of Phil Coulson out there. For those that have watched the series, you know. So, the fact that all the way back in 2012, they're like, obviously the very first Iron Man movie gave us the idea of the Avengers Initiative in the first place. And then we get, these other movies introducing more characters. So then we ultimately end up with our OG Avengers team. And then they're like, okay, so we got to this point. So what are we going to do to get the people excited for what's coming next? Oh, let's throw Thanos in there, which at the time I had no idea who Thanos was. I didn't know what that face meant. I knew it meant trouble, but I had no idea. And everybody's like, oh my God, Thanos. And I'm like, Thanos? Let me do, onto the interwebs. And what's funny is we don't see Thanos again for like 5-6 years. He's going to sit his giant purple ass on that throne of his for like another half a decade before he's finally like, fine, I'll do it myself. Oh my. The idea of the whole planet knows now that there are things out there. The stuff that like only Nick Fury knew or a handful of people knew, now everybody knows. And that is that's important for, again, what is what happens down the line, and what it means for our heroes going forward, and what it means for the other people that come along. Nick Fury, when he goes to meet up with Steve early on in the movie, and he says like the world's a lot weirder and stranger, and then you realize, which is where they make the bet, he's not exaggerating by any means, and by the time this, they reach the end of this and win, now the entire world knows that things are a lot weirder and stranger than they realize, and it changes, Earth. There's some argument on what Earth designation, or the majority of the MCU takes place in, but I'm sticking with Earth 616. As far as Earth 616 is concerned, this changes everything, and ultimately it's going to change the entire universe beyond Earth 616 and to other Earths as well, which we have seen in things like the Fantastic 4, and we'll probably see again, maybe not necessarily in Doomsday. We'll see if they use what I love that Marvel has done, because they have such a huge catalog to pull characters and plots and all sorts of fun stuff from, is even when they decide to do well-known storylines, they still give it its own twist. They're not just taking the comic book pages and be like, we're just going to recreate this in real life. They're like, no, stuff may have happened this way in the comic book, but here on the screen, things are going to go a little differently, which, ultimately keeps it from being, it keeps it fresh. It keeps people on their toes, because there are some people that know some of these comic book storylines very, very well. And, they keep, they can go watch the movie and be pleasantly surprised, because it doesn't play out the way that they know it plays out in the comic books. But what Doctor Doom is capable of, and what we've seen with our few dips into the multiverse and the specific comics they are supposedly pulling from for Secret Ward, or whatever, part 2 of Doomsday, essentially, the fallout from Doomsday, the idea that this Earth is where things really changed, as far as everyday people having knowledge of space and aliens and superheroes and magic and technology and all that, is, again, it's hard to tell how far ahead they were planning, because it's some, it's like best laid plans, but always, shit happens. So I'm sure they had contingencies and stuff too, but nothing I'm sure was ever like completely set in stone. But so they didn't necessarily know what was going to be happening almost 8 years after this movie. But I think it's going to be one of those happy, like, continuity things in a way, where it worked out that this, looking back, to be like, oh, that was not accidental. That is absolutely on purpose. If they go the way I think they're going to go. But time will tell. We gotta get through Spider-Man Brand New Day first, and then we gotta hit Doomsday, and then whatever happens from Doomsday, well, we're just in, like, Thanos was formidable, obviously. That, was absolutely formidable. With the Infinity Gauntlet and the stones and everything. We've seen some very, very powerful adversaries in some individual movies, obviously. With Ragnarok, that was a big deal. The destruction of Asgard. With the Fantastic Four, with Galactus. Again, not an easy, not a walk in the park as far as foes are concerned. So, Loki was our antagonist, but he is, at the end of it all, he is just a pawn in a much, he's a small fish in a much bigger pond of much bigger, very strong, very capable, very smart baddies out there. And the fact that early on they decided to be like, Thanos, he's going to be part of this equation. It's like, that's setting the bar very high. And obviously they met that bar. But it's like, where do you go from there? Doomsday, that's where we're going.
And I guess we'll see how that fares exactly, because I guess as you get to further on with your films and stuff, you obviously have to keep upping the ante when it comes to your antagonists or villains. I mean, this is a great ending for multiple reasons, because it does feel less like a climax and more like a release of pressure that's been building the entire time. I mean, up until that point, Everything is friction, the clashing egos, the conflicting approaches, and a constant sense that this whole thing might fall apart before it ever works. So when the final stretch arrives, it isn't just about stopping a threat. It's about proving that all that tension can actually resolve into something functional. And what I think stands out is how cleanly it comes together. Not simple, but clear. Everyone falls into place without it feeling forced. The chaos doesn't disappear, it gets organized. And that's a subtle difference, but it matters. And the film isn't saying the mess is gone, it's saying the mess can be directed. And there's also, I think, a kind of visual clarity to it. The scale is huge, but you never lose track of what's happening or why. And that's harder than it looks, because big finales often blur into noise. But here you can follow the movement, the intent behind each action. It feels coordinated, almost like watching separate threads finally weave into a single pattern. And then it pulls back. And that's the part I like most. Because after all the noise, it doesn't overstay. It lets things settle. There is a quiet acknowledgement that what just happened worked, but also that it was temporary. This isn't a permanent solution, it's a moment of alignment. So you're left with a sense of completion, but not closure. I mean, the world hasn't changed in a clean, final way. If anything, to your point, it feels more open, more uncertain. But now there's proof that under the right pressure, something coherent can come out of all that instability. And it ends not by wrapping everything up neatly, but by showing that the machine runs. And that's enough. And, you know, when it comes to mid and post-credit scenes, they're doing something pretty deliberate structurally, not just tossing in bonus content. Because starting with the mid-credit scene, this is where things get interesting. Because we see, as I said, the other reporting back after the failed invasion, and his line is key. Challenging Earth is to court death. And that's not just dramatic phrasing, it's literal, because he's speaking on behalf of Thanos, who, in the comics, has a long-standing obsession with death as both a concept and a figure. So then when we see Thanos turn and smile, the film is doing two things at once. On the surface, it's a reveal, like we were saying, introducing a larger antagonist, but structurally, it reframes the conflict we just watched. As you were saying, Rachel, Loki is no longer the primary agent of chaos. He's an intermediary. The real narrative weight shifts upward towards this more abstract cosmic level of threat. And what I think is especially effective is how minimal the scene is. There's no exposition explaining who Thanos is or what he wants. The film trusts the moment to function as a seed rather than a payoff. And in hindsight, I think it's the clearest early signal that the MCU wasn't just building sequels. It was building toward convergence, something that eventually materialized in Infinity War and Endgame. Now, you contrast that with the post-credit scene, which operates on an entirely different axis. The shawarma scene is almost anti-spectacle. You know, after a film defined by escalation and bigger threats and bigger action, it deliberately collapses the scale. You literally have our Avengers all sitting in silence. No dialogue, no plot advancement, no explicit joke even. It's just duration. Time is passing as they eat. So I guess, you know, from an analytical standpoint, this scene functions as decompression, because it allows us, the audience, to come down from the climax while reinforcing the physical and emotional toll of what just happened. But I think more importantly, it redefines the team dynamic. The Avengers aren't unified through a triumphant speech or a symbolic gesture. They're unified through shared aftermath. And that's the interesting symmetry between the two scenes. You know, the mid-credit scene expands the narrative outward, introducing this larger system of power and control. The post-credit scene contracts it inward, you know, focusing on the human, or at least human-adjacent experience of surviving that system. So I guess you end up with this dual movement. You have escalation and grounding, and one promises that the stakes will get bigger. The other quietly insists that the characters still matter at a personal level. And that balance, you know, cosmic inevitability versus lived experience, is really what defines the MCU at its best. So I would say it's a stellar ending to a great movie.
And the funny thing is the shawarma scene was a last minute addition.
Really?
Yeah, that was something that was added. They realized that they could that Tony has that line, and they realized that they could do something with it to kind of because it's that the post credit scene as opposed to the mid credit with Thanos, because that reveal of Thanos is such a big deal, and they were like, maybe we should let the people leave the audience with a little like less clenched, hands on the armrests, clenched buttholes, like we've had with some of these movies where you just walk out like, oh my God, it's like, what's going to happen? That's the way I walked out of Infinity War. I'm like, but because it was filmed after they had already finished principal photography, so it was essentially a pickup. They had to get everybody back, get them in costume. Chris Evans had grown out a beard for another role, so that's why Steve is sitting the way he is, leaning on his fist to cover Chris's beard that he had grown out for his next role. So, because it was added so last minute to the movie. But it's great. You're right. It's a moment of them allowing them to kind of like, come down from the high, the adrenaline and everything. It allows you to see some of the aftermath. These poor people that presumably own and operate this shop, are trying to clean up the mess that these guys created, and yet they come in asking for food. Like hopefully Tony paid and left a really big tip. And it also gives us a mid or post credit scene that isn't that serious, because we've had so many that are like consequential to the MCU. That very first one with Samuel L. Jackson. I want to hear talk about the Avengers Initiative. It's like, that moment is so big that it's like that could have been part of the actual movie, and then the credits could have ran. And then people could have gotten their cars and gotten home. But no, they didn't make it part of the bigger run of the movie. Instead it ends with I am Iron Man. You get credits. And, up to this point, mid-post-credit scenes were just a kind of a fun thing that some movies did occasionally, but it wasn't like a regular thing. But for them to be something that if you stayed in the movie theater and didn't leave as soon as the credits started rolling, you got a treat. You got to see something that a whole bunch of other people missed because they didn't stay. And then word's going to get around. And suddenly now, almost 20 years later, you go to a Marvel movie, even if they tell you, like, how many scenes there are, or if any at all, we still stay, just in case. Even if those scenes ultimately don't really carry any weight for the larger MCU as a whole, some of them are just funny or entertaining and don't play into the bigger plot. But in this case, you get a little of both. You're getting one that is very consequential, but also something that is just kind of a bit of levity and a bit of, look at that. Without being like, oh my God, what does that mean? And you're suddenly going home to the internet on some social media site, talking to everybody else, overanalyzing everything until ultimately, hopefully, somebody comes along and explains. And sometimes they do. Sometimes the powers that be, Kevin Feige or whoever directed the movie will be like, here, this is what this means. Sometimes they wait a little while, to give people time to go see the movies, and then sometimes they don't. Sometimes they don't explain it, and they just let us have our online rants and brainstorming sessions.
They most certainly do. But yes, I think it was just really clever, albeit it was last minute, but I think it was very clever. It did make me definitely want to try shawarma. And apparently, Zan was very upset after this movie because when she left the theater, all the shawarma places were closed, sadly. So I guess there is that. So I guess then if we were the Academy segment, because this film was nominated for Best Visual Effects at the 85th Academy Awards, but it lost to Life of Pi, which was also the film which walked away with most statues. For the Best Picture went to Argo, and the film with the most nominations was actually Lincoln with 12. So Rachel, do you think this film should have beaten Life of Pi for what it was nominated for, and could it have been nominated for anything else?
I mean, obviously the fangirl part of me is like, yes, give it all the awards. The more logical part of me is like, we have seen this really since these types of movies have started to become more and more common and do gangbusters at the box office and have a large, fan following, that when it comes to award season, at least the more quote unquote, big air quotes, prestigious awards, these get looked over except in the technical categories, because that's how these organizations see them, is they see them as spectacle, as something, really astounding looking and sounding, but not I think I'm taking this a little personally as a fangirl, but to me, outside of a few exceptions, they don't get recognition in the more, quote, again, air quotes, prestigious categories. Because I don't think that especially the Academy, I mean, this is, gold standard, the Oscars podcast, so we're specifically talking about the Academy here. I don't think the Academy takes these movies seriously, to be honest with you. Other than, I don't think they see the direction that goes into this sort of thing, the writing, taking these comic books and adapting them in a way that makes sense for the screen and gives people, the look and feel that they expect from reading a comic book. The acting, I think that a lot of them, they see a bunch of actors running around spandex, and I just don't think they take it seriously. I know they don't. That's the thing. Effing Scorsese himself has shot down these types of movies and has absolutely told us his opinion of them, and he doesn't like them. And yet the guy's going and he's going to be in Star Wars. So make it make sense. Maybe Star Wars is more prestigious in his mind, or maybe his daughter just bore him down enough. I don't know. But there's something to be said about being able to do this. This is like the equivalent of Return of the King. The build up, the culmination, the storytelling, the world building, the establishing of the rules and everything, and who these characters are and their personalities and the places, the things, the who, what, when, where, how, ultimately was leading to this. And those of us that had absolutely jumped in and were like, I'm here for the ride, I'm here for the party. Coming out of the movie theater after seeing this, you're like, absolutely, all the hard work that went into building everything to lead to this, and they pulled it off. And then they would ultimately pull it off again. When we reach the culmination of the this kicks off, with Thanos. It kickstarts the not knowing yet that that's ultimately what it's going to be, but the Infinity Saga, and then going into Infinity War and Endgame, and everything that led up to this, and then take that and then add on top everything that came after this into Infinity War is shit ton. That's a lot of world building. That's a lot of new characters. It's a whole bunch of more information and canon and continuity. And the Russo brothers pulled it off, not just for one, but for two movies, and gave us the bookend in a way to this. You've got so much character growth. You know, we've got Thor, who's very confident in this, and then loses his confidence because of Infinity War, and have to regain that confidence in Endgame. You have Clint and Natasha's relationship and their loyalty to each other get to the point where they are faced with the ultimate decision that one of them is going to have to die to be able to save the rest of their loved ones. And they are both willing to sacrifice themselves because of what it means, and the other person won't let them do it. And ultimately Natasha wins. You know, which, yeah, yes, it sucks that Natasha had to die, but I think Natasha's reasoning ultimately makes sense. She's not the one with a spouse and kids to go home to. I mean, at that time, Clint's family is gone. They've been dusted, but that's what they're working towards, is getting him back. And she would rather die with the belief that they are going to be successful to bringing everybody back who got dusted, and that means Clint is going to get his family back. She is willing to make that sacrifice. You've got Bruce, who has been fighting the idea of the Hulk, and then ultimately finds that balance with, you know, Smart Hulk or Professor Hulk or whatever you want to call him, and then ultimately being the one that has to absorb the radiation to use the glove to bring everybody back, which thankfully does not kill him, but does do severe damage to him. To, you know, to that point, the Hulk seemed almost, you know, indestructible, but it's his brains and the Hulk's essentially brawn is what ultimately is able to bring them, you know, be part of the team that brings everybody back. You've got Steve, who, by being the person who's constantly been doing the right thing for his friends, his loved ones, the world at large, the universe at large, trying to be the leader when they, you know, when they lose and Thanos is successful at, you know, getting rid of 50% of everybody, and Steve is one of the ones left behind and has to be one of the people to try to figure out how to move on, but also realize, you know, still putting himself in that leadership role of trying to help everybody else figure out how to move on, and just making sacrifice after sacrifice after sacrifice, and then finally being the one that gets to return the stones and seeing an opportunity to finally do something selfish for himself and be reunited with Peggy is a beautiful, beautiful ending for Steve Rogers, at least of that particular timeline. And then you have Tony. You know, he and Steve have that argument on the helicarrier. You know, and Steve is like, "You're not the one to go running into a firefight. You're not the one to lay on the wire while everyone else, you know, gets to run for cover or whatever." And Tony's like, "Well, I'll just cut the wire." And Steve's like, "Oh, yeah, just always looking for the easy way out." And ultimately, Tony does lay on the wire. He sacrifices himself because he knows he was flat out told by the wizard with the magic necklace that there were millions and millions and millions and millions of ways that this could have played out. But there is only one way they can ultimately win, and that is for Tony to sacrifice himself, to do the one thing that we thought that Tony Stark we were introduced to in the first Iron Man would never, ever do. And I think that, you know, it makes me sad even now. It's been how many years since Endgame? Like, what, 7? Close to 7? And, you know, just seeing Tony, it's just years and years and years and years of everything. I mean, even before this, he knew that there was something and he knew it started at the Battle of New York. He just knew there was something like, so, like sort of Damocles hanging over him or something. And he's finally faced with it. And even though he has gotten everything that he probably didn't know he wanted or thought he deserved, he's got Pepper. He's got a beautiful wife that gets him and understands him and balances him out. He's got a beautiful daughter. He gets to be a parent. So, ultimately, I'm sure he hopes that he's being a better parent than Howard was to him, better father than Howard was to him. But as much as he has gotten everything he ever wanted, there probably, there may be a part of him that thinks he doesn't even deserve it. Hopefully not. But anything he could, more than he probably could have dreamed of as far as potential happy ending, and he has to give it up. He has to do, it ultimately comes down to him doing exactly what Steve, all the way back in this movie, said that he would never do. And that is lay on the wire to save others. And I think that's heartbreaking, yet so beautiful for the storyline that is Tony Stark in the MCU. And I really wish the Academy would see that. I'm glad that they gave the Black Panther has gotten some acknowledgement in the more prestigious categories. I consider costume kind of in the middle. It's not a technical award, but it's not, one of the acting or screenplay or directing categories. But costume is still up there, and I love that Ruth Carter has won twice. I love that the score has won. I love the fact that Black Panther has been nominated for Best Picture. But I still think the Academy is not taking these movies as seriously as they should, especially where we are now. Those of us that have stuck with it, for pretty much the entire time, obviously we're emotionally invested and probably a little biased. I will admit, professional fangirl. I have various Marvel related things on my car. My car is named Phil. Okay. I named my car after Coulson. Obviously I'm a little biased, but I really wish that, compare 2012 to now, or leading up to the bookend of this, which is Endgame, that the Academy would really, be like Loki and get their heads out of their asses and recognize that this is not just, yes, they're big money makers. They are big mainstream, huge fan following films. This was, at the time, this was the highest grossing movie. It was one of three, I think, movies. It was like the third movie to break $1 billion. The $1 billion mark. Now it's wild to think that, nowadays, MCU movie breaks $1 billion. Like, yeah, okay. That tracks. But this is one of the Battle of New York was a fixed point. This movie was a fixed point and a very important, landmark in the idea of using film to tell this kind of story. And the fact that Feige and everyone not every single one has been just like, blow your mind off the charts, whatever, movie. But I mean, they pretty much have been successful time after time after time after time after movie after movie after movie after movie. At least as far as the MCU, direct MCU is concerned. The less we talk about some of those fringe Sony movies, probably the better. But Um, I mean, I could rant probably till I'm blue in the face, and it ultimately, unfortunately, I don't think would make a difference. But yeah, the Academy missed an opportunity to acknowledge something that had been achieved, that even the person that helped found this idea walked away a year later because he did not believe in it, says something. And the fact that they're still doing it all these years later and have been doing it for almost 20 years without some, I mean, ultimately at the end of the day, I don't really care what the Academy has to say, but as someone in the nerd community and recognizes that there are still, ultimately I don't really care what other people think, but I acknowledge that there are people that do. And I also acknowledge that there are people out there that think these are fluff and, don't, can't even acknowledge that it's just good cinema. It's good movie making. At least for some of these, is insulting.
I definitely think so too. I mean, hopefully at some point we did get close with Black Panther being nominated for Best Picture, but I guess here, 14 years removed from when this came out, I can kind of see why things were still the way they were. I guess when it comes to this, as you were saying, Rachel, this film does feel like the kind of film that should sweep technical awards. It's huge. It's seamless, and at the time, it raised the bar for how convincing large-scale action could look. I will say this, when you put it next to Life of Pi, which was obviously one of its competitors, you start to see why it lost at the Academy Awards, because Life of Pi isn't just using visual effects to enhance a story. The effects are the storytelling, the ocean, the tiger, the shifting reality of what's real and what isn't. All of that depends entirely on digital work that had to carry emotional weight and not just spectacle. And it does it in a way that feels almost invisible at times, even though it's incredibly complex. By contrast, this film uses visual effects brilliantly, but in a more expected way. As in, it's about scale and impact and clarity, the destruction, the movement, the choreography of everything happening at once. It's extremely well done, but it doesn't transform the language of storytelling in the same way. And as we know, the Academy tends to reward effects that feel essential rather than impressive, and I think Life of Pi had that edge. As for whether it should have won, I think once again, it depends on what you value. If you care about coordination and coherence and making something that massive feel watchable and grounded, there is a strong argument for it. That final act alone is a technical achievement. But if you're looking at innovation and emotional integration of video effects, it's harder to argue against Life of Pi. Now, nominations, this is where it gets, I think, more interesting, because you could make a case for a few areas. Editing, I mean, the way the film handles multiple threads in the final act without losing clarity is genuinely impressive. It's not flashy editing, but it's precise. I would also add sound, both mixing and editing, because the layering of chaos and dialogue and action is doing a lot of invisible work. And the score, not necessarily for complexity, but for how effectively it creates identity and momentum. So why didn't it get more nominations? I agree with you, Rachel. Part of it is bias, because whether people like to admit it or not, big franchise films, especially comic book ones, were still not taken as seriously by the Academy back then. They were definitely seen as entertainment first and craft second. That has shifted a little bit over time, but in 2013, it was still very much the case. I think there's also the issue of visibility. A lot of what the Avengers does well is designed not to draw attention to itself. It's smooth and controlled and almost invisible in how it guides you. And awards tend to go to things that feel more obviously artistic or transformative. And finally, competition matters. I mean, that year had films that were more aligned with what the Academy traditionally rewards, both in tone and style. So I guess in the end, it wasn't snubbed so much as it was outpositioned. It excelled at making something incredibly difficult look easy. And ironically, I think that can make it easier to overlook when awards season comes around. Hopefully, we'll be more open to these kind of films as things progress. You know, we have seen a little bit of opening when it comes to Black Panther, and I guess we'll see what happens down the pipe when it comes to genre movies, which was, of course, a discussion we did have recently on Patreon. So, getting thus to ratings, what do you give this film out of 10?
Like anybody has to ask, this is getting a 10. This is one of my handful of movies that I will give a 10 to. Is it technically perfect? No. I mean, some of the CGI has dated a little. There's jokes in there that a few years down the line, it's maybe not as maybe I think they were going for maybe a cheap laugh. In some cases, but ultimately, like I said, this is the culmination of a lot of moving pieces that, like I said, the guy that helped found the studio walked away a year after founding it, saying, "This is never going to work. Good luck to you. Bye." And they did it, and they've done it again and again and again. I mean, with the OG Avengers, we've got what, 6 characters, 7. You can count with your fingers and have fingers left over. By the time we get to Endgame, there's so many characters, so many pieces on the board. It should not work, but it does, because the people who make these movies care and are paying attention to what they're doing. They know that they're not making a movie that is in a vacuum. It is part of a much bigger puzzle and universe, literally and figuratively. And this is the proof of concept. And if this hadn't worked, everything could have fallen apart, probably would have fallen apart, and we wouldn't have gotten what we've gotten since. So you cannot deny the importance of this movie as far as the MCU is concerned. So it's an absolute 10 out of 10 for me.
Totally fair. And I think, yes, the importance of this film within the genre and within the bigger story is definitely undeniable. I'm going to give this an 8.5 out of 10. What I think holds it up that high, yes, is how well it does something that should have been much messier. Bring together multiple established leads, each with their own tone and history, and making it feel coherent is not a small thing. The film doesn't just juggle them, it builds tension out of their differences and then pays it off in a way that feels earned. And that structure alone carries a lot of weight. And it's also extremely watchable and rewatchable. The pacing is tight without feeling rushed, the humor lands without undercutting the stakes, and the final act is still one of the clearest large-scale action sequences put on screen. And you always know where you are and why it matters, which sounds basic, but a lot of films at this scale still struggle with that. And I think what keeps it from getting higher, at least for me, is that at its core, it plays things relatively safe. As in, the emotional arcs are effective, but not especially deep. And the themes, while present, aren't pushed as far as they could be. They would be later in other films, and aims for precision over risk. And it succeeds on those terms, but it doesn't quite reach beyond them. So you end up with something that's exceptionally well crafted, consistently engaging and influential in what it's set up going forward, even if it doesn't fully stretch into something more ambitious or lasting on a deeper level. I think it's the kind of film you can revisit easily, you enjoy every time, and still recognize that it's operating just a step below truly great, which we would get, I think, down the line with Endgame ultimately. So it's an 8.5 out of 10 for me. So getting then to gold standard feedback this week, we do have quite a few, starting with Dave Proctor, who writes in about today's movie. So Rachel, what does Dave have for us?
He says, "Hello, cinephiles. I grew up reading Marvel comics, so forgive me if this gets ridiculous." Oh, we love ridiculous, Dave. "Before the MCU, I watched everything ever made that was comic related. The MCU started organizing all the movies into crisscrossing, interwoven stories like their comics. This movie in particular brought together many of my favorites. It is a little different from the comic book original lineup: Iron Man, Thor, the Hulk, Ant-Man, and the Wasp. They did think about bringing Ant-Man, at least Ant-Man, in, and ultimately decided not to because they had its own standalone story yet. And then all those years later, we find out that Ant-Man was at the Battle of New York anyway. Kind of. Wibbly wobbly time away. To be honest, the Avengers without Captain America wouldn't feel right. Hank Pym's personality in the comics wasn't really endearing, and not much in the movies either. The movies did a pretty good job of creating a universe of superpowered people that felt like we were at the beginning. I like the way the introductions in previous movies fed into this movie and had new heroes without rehashing origins. You learn as you go if you don't already know. Thor seems a little aloof considering how his origin movie worked so hard to humanize him. He didn't change completely overnight. He's got some growing to do. I learned something watching this. I read this earlier. This is funny. Thor throws his hammer, and Hulk grabs it and flies back. Hulk tries to pick up the hammer and cannot. However, the impact of the Hulk and the hammer has absolutely no effect on the helicarrier or the deck. That should be a force of tons. The boat, quote, is already unstable. I guess what I learned was that the helicarrier was worthy, and since it was holding the hammer, it had the power of Thor, which is why that shock didn't crash. It's kind of like the elevator. The elevator worthy? Maybe the helicarrier is worthy as well. That's funny. I like that, Dave. I lost a little confidence in shield training. The idiot that couldn't find the ocean at sunrise without GPS was shockingly sad. I never picked up on that in previous watches. I was always loving the line delivered by Sam Jackson. I would just clock that up to panic. Yeah, that's why they're a desk jockey and not a master assassin like Clint Natasha. Maybe, or he was too busy playing Galaga. I don't know. Speaking of Sam Jackson, great Nick Fury. I remember getting confused as a kid about Nick Fury and Reed Richards looking so much alike except for the eye patch. This Nick Fury will stand out in so many ways. A strong African-American actor that can play many roles, but this is dead center of his talent zone. Actually, you kind of play Sam Jackson and everything, and that fits with Fury. Which is why they have that nice little nod to one of his other famous roles on Nick Fury's tombstone. One of my favorite bits is when Captain America tells the cop what he needs, and the cop asks why he should take orders from him. Show, don't tell. The cop was convinced. Besides, he had no idea what to do after before that. Any real negative with this movie would just be nitpicking. I loved it then and still do. I think some of the shine is worn off the franchise, but they really have surprised me with Wonder Man and Daredevil Born Again. Actually, I'm loving all the series because they can tell a much less rushed story. Back in 2012, we were just getting started. My childhood was being put on the screen, and they did it well. I give this movie 10 out of 10. Bloody Captain America World War II cards. I can't remember. I don't think they ever brought this up in Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., even though Nick Fury did make a couple of appearances. But you gotta wonder if Phil did not give Run Fury the riot act when he found out what Fury did with those cards, considering they were near meant just like floxing around the edges. I am left with one question for you to answer for me. What is shawarma and will I like it? Thanks, David K. Proctor. Well, I don't know, Dave, if you would like shawarma or not, but I can tell you it's a popular street food in the Middle East that originated in Levant during the Ottoman Empire. It consists of meat cut into thin slices, stacked in an inverted cone, and roasted on a slow-turning vertical split. Traditionally made with lamb or mutton, and may also be made with chicken, turkey, meat, beef, falafel, or veal. The surface of the rotisserie meat is routinely shaved off once it cooks and is ready to be served. But yeah, you have to like those Middle Eastern type spices. So
it is an acquired taste, but yes, if you do like, if that is your style, I think you definitely would enjoy it. I have had shawarma quite a few times because I do enjoy Middle Eastern cuisine, but it's fantastic. I thoroughly enjoy it. Plus, being a big meat eater, of course, it fuels that fire as well.
You can get it at the Disney parks. They do have a shawarma cart at Avengers Campus. It was never open when Chauncey and I were there, so we never got to try it. One of these days we will. But over in Epcot, in World Showcase, where each section is represents a different country of the world, the section from Morocco has both a like fast food, air quote, walk up, order to go food, and they also have a sit down restaurant. Presumably, it's on the menu of the sit down restaurant too. I've never actually eaten there. Should. Apparently, they got a belly dancer. But the more fast foody place did start serving shawarma after this movie came out. They probably still do. It's probably slightly more authentic because it is Morocco and they try to be as authentic to what you would get if you were in the actual country as opposed to an Avengers campus, where it's probably more similar to like New York shawarma, like what you would have gotten if you'd been with the Avengers in the post-credit scene. But I haven't had either, so I can't, tell you if either of them are actually any good or not. And again, I don't know what style specifically they serve, so that may make a difference because it depends on what meat will determine like what you get as far as like sauce and sides and stuff. So
I do suggest it though. I think if you want to have tried it or something etc. like this, I strongly would recommend it. At least that's my personal opinion. So Dave, if you get the chance, definitely try it and let us know. And of course, great feedback as always. Speaking of great feedback, we also have some from Aaron Case who writes in about this one. As always, Aaron loves to put fun little subject lines to his emails. And this one, of course, it's Puny God. Great choice. And so Aaron writes in, hello, Gold Standard hosts. Hey, Aaron. The Avengers was a cultural event that wouldn't be matched again until Avengers Endgame, and while Endgame may be the pinnacle of the MCU, I firmly believe that people have forgotten just how monumental the first Avengers movie really was. Iron Man was a very fun movie that included a post-credits scene laying the foundation of what could be, but it wasn't until Stark's appearance in The Incredible Hulk that the full impact of a shared universe finally started to take shape. It took 4 years and 5 movies to make sure the world was established before Marvel took a gigantic swing and brought all their heroes together in one big movie. The Avengers was their make or break moment, and no matter how simple this idea seemed, both then and now, everything that came before and everything that could come after balanced upon how well Marvel could stick the landing of what would later be called Phase 1. And with all this planning and preparation, they not only stuck the landing, but left audiences feeling excited for anything that was to follow. While his name means very little these days, I do have to credit writer-director Joss Whedon for finding a way to take all these characters and crafting a story in which every character, big or small, gets proper screen time. As for our heroes, they all naturally come together. You can put all these people on a team, but that doesn't mean it's going to work out well. A story needs to be created in which they all unite and work together, and I find humor in the self-aware moment in which Fury uses Coulson's trading cards to do just that. That moment in which our titular team finally stands in a circle, the theme blaring, camera revolving, is iconic for a reason. Indeed. Our cast is great as expected, as by this point most are all comfortable with their characters. There's 2 outliers, Banner and Barton. Ruffalo makes his debut, being a very different Banner than the previous Norton, someone who I still wish had continued with the MCU. I still believe that the Incredible Hulk is underappreciated and Norton was a great choice for the role. But where he was constantly on the movie looking for a cure, Ruffalo's Banner is much more restrained, someone who has resigned to his fate and wants to simply be left alone. It's a little hard to imagine Norton in this movie, no matter how much I would have liked to see it. As for Barton, it's a shame that we really don't get to know him in this movie. Renner has a cameo in Thor, then has a few sentences at the start of the Avengers, but then spends most of the time being mind-controlled. I know Age of Ultron isn't highly regarded, but I do appreciate that his character gets more defined in the sequel. Unfortunately, I don't believe it deserved any Oscars that year, but that's okay. The Academy insists on recognizing prestigious films, yet this is a movie designed to be pure fun and excitement for audiences wanting to have a break from the real world. More often than I care to admit, I think back to Martin Scorsese stating that the MCU wasn't real cinema, comparing the movies to amusement parks. And you know what? I disagree with the first part, but agree with the second. To separate movies and cinema is a very pretentious statement. And furthermore, what's wrong with amusement parks? Not all movies need to be thought-provoking. We need movies that help us relax and unwind from day-to-day life, and this is one of those movies. And finally, if it's all the same to you, I think I'll have that drink now. Take care, Aaron. Well, Aaron, that was an absolutely fantastic email. And Rachel, it seems like you and Aaron are in simpatico when it comes to a lot of thoughts there. Of course, dear listeners, if you want to be like the wonderful Dave and Aaron and share your thoughts on the films we discuss here, you can do so by shooting an email to goldstandardoscars@gmail.com. Once again, goldstandardoscars@gmail.com. Be sure to follow us on our social media if you're not doing so already. You can find us on X as Oscars Gold, Facebook, where you can find us as Gold Standard the Oscars podcast, and also Blue Sky, where you can also find us as Oscars Gold. We love hearing from you guys. We appreciate the follow and the support. And also, if you'd like to hear us discuss your favorite films, you can join our wonderful family of patrons on Patreon and check out what we have going on there. Of course, you'll get to unlock our previous reviews of such films as selected by our patrons, such as recently Captain Phillips, Sense and Sensibility, The Illusionist, 1917, and many more. So to join our Golden Army, head on over to patreon.com/goldstandardoscars, and a big thank you to our wonderful patrons for their support. Speaking of which, this month, our patrons have selected Prey for us to review, so we'll definitely be looking forward to talk about that one. And also, regardless of the platforms you're listening to when it comes to this podcast, be it Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Pandora, etc., be sure to rate and review us, as that keeps the algorithm stimulated and allows our little podcast to reach more like-minded ears like yours. Tell your friends, tell your enemies, tell your colleagues, tell your pets. We don't care. Just spread the good word. Big thank you to those who have done so. Future thank you to those who will. So, Rachel, when you're not here discussing Earth's mightiest heroes, where can folks find you?
Well, you can still hear me talk about Earth's mightiest heroes, the MCU as a whole, among other things, with the Five-ish Fangirls podcast, for a mostly weekly pop culture and entertainment podcast where we talk about all sorts of geeky and dirty things from the female perspective, because fangirls are real fans too. We have some weird scheduling stuff happening right now, but we did let our listeners know via Patreon and the last episode that went out that stuff was happening. But we've got more than 500 episodes, so it's not like if you're just finding us, you're hurting for content. And all of those episodes can be found wherever you find podcasts and at the fiveishfangirls.com, where you can connect with all of our podcast-related social media accounts and our individual ones as well, which I highly recommend doing, because as we're recording this, Indie PopCon is in 2 weeks.
Oh, very nice. So just round the corner. So I know a great time for you, Rachel. I know you thoroughly enjoy that convention, as you do pretty much all the conventions that you attend, but I know it's going to be very exciting to hear news from Indie PopCon. And of course, when it comes to our missing co-host, Zan, you can, of course, check her out and what she does, especially when it comes to podcasting. Drunk Cinema is the place where her and Charles Skaggs watch films, enjoy adult beverages, have an adult conversation, and review said films for your entertainment. Also, if you want to connect with her on her social media accounts, you can usually find her on Instagram and TikTok, where her handle is Udinax19. When it comes to myself, you can find me in my day job hosting the radio show Whiskey and Cigarettes, where we play the very best and nothing but the best of country music for you guys, from Alabama to Bailey Zimmerman. For more information about that, you can visit our website, which is whiskeyandcigarettesshow.com. Podcast-wise, if you're fans, of course, of movies like The Avengers, you can find myself and Keith Bliss on Happiness in Darkness, the superhero movie podcast, where we do discuss any and every superhero movie under the sun and beyond. We also are kind of going past just the superhero stuff. We're looking to the heroic stuff as well. We recently reviewed Pride and Prejudice and Zombies, which was the first time I ever watched that film, and it was quite the watch, I will say. Coming up next, we're going to be going back into the animated world, as we will be reviewing Kung Fu Panda 2, which I am very excited about. And the last but certainly not least, myself and Charles Skaggs can be found on the Fandom Zone podcast, where we're currently reviewing the second season of Daredevil Born Again. So far, it has definitely been excellent. And speaking to come on this show, next time, Keith Bliss will be returning to the podcast, and the film that he will be bringing with him is very different from this one, the 1989 David Schmuller film, Puppet Master. So, Rachel, anything you would like to add on our next movie or anything else before we sign off?
From what I understand, the first movie, because there's more than one, because that's the way it is with horror films, the first one is not bad, but once you get into sequel territory, it gets really effing ridiculous. Like, the premise is pretty ridiculous to begin with, but once you get into sequel territory, I guess, like, as far as, like, plot and special effects, yeah, they don't put as much thought and money into it, so it gets really ridiculous beyond the first one. So, I've not seen it, but I'm aware of it, and I'm aware of the ridiculousness of the sequels, so I'm interested, because I'm not one of those people that gets scared by, like, toys and stuff like that. Like, I know some people like dolls and things, they can freak them out, but I'm not one of those people, so we'll see. Yeah. I prefer my horror where it doesn't take itself too seriously. From what I understand, this one does not, so it might be something that I find tolerable, at least. So, and I should say, as we're recording this, unfortunately she's not here, but happy belated birthday to Sam.
Agreed. Happy belated birthday, Zan, if indeed you are listening. And of course, looking forward to having her back with us, of course, and the trio to be complete at last. So I guess we'll see what we all make of this one. So folks, thanks as always for listening to the show and supporting us. We will see you next time with Puppet Master and on Patreon with Prey. Until then, enjoy those movies. Keep that popcorn hot. Big thank you to Dave and Aaron for writing in. And an all-round thank you all so much for the privilege of your time. Ciao, my people.